We have the chairman with us again, setting a new TAC land speed record of 2 meetings in a row. And he has to leave for a couple other meetings at 1:30, and so we're going to start and get right down to business. But I want to thank everybody for coming. Mr. Chairman, thank you for being here. I can say one thing about what's happening now, and that is that this is kind of like the game shows on TV, okay? Where the prizes increase, but the questions get a lot harder. And this group is dealing with the harder follow-on questions to the kind of things we did last year, and we've agreed to double their compensation over what they received last year as well. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
It's the least we can do, and we try to do that. You should know, by the way, that one of our superstars who was here for almost 3 years, Tom Brown, was a Jeopardy repeat winner. Oh. He actually went and did Jeopardy while he was working without telling us until afterwards. But he's great. I think it's on the internet. So I'm not going to speak. Tom's been keeping me updated on what you've all been working on. And I wish I could stay longer, but I can't today, unfortunately. But I'm happy to be here. What you're doing is so important, and let's get to work. I will be following up with Tom and Julie and Walter and getting the full briefing on everything that happens today. And I just want you to continue to know that what you're all doing together is something, A, that I really appreciate, and B, that's having a significant impact on our work and on the country, and on meeting some really important, difficult Jeopardy-level challenges. So thanks, Tom.
Okay, Kevin, you're up. The chairman at the last session asked us to address some specific issues on wireless security and privacy, and Kevin's working group has been working on that since then and has report for us today. So take it away, Kevin. Do you want
to pass the ceremony?
You want the non-throwing of the clicker comes around.
Am I live? Yeah. While the clicker is coming around, first of all, thanks. I'm honored that we get to go first here. No pressure. But oh, jeez.
Oh, David.
Okay.
David, whoa, wait a minute. There are penalties for throwing the clicker.
That's all right. That's all right. No problem. It's kind of an icebreaker, I guess. A liquid icebreaker. So right up front, I wanted to kind of give a big picture summary of what our working group has done. And I'm going to be doing the speaking, but this represents the contributions of the full team that you see up on the slide, both the TAC members and the other additional members who've been working with us pretty closely. I think that, to summarize where we're coming out on this, and kind of foreshadowed this in the June meeting, that the areas, we've taken a broad scope to wireless security, because just looking at one part, like wireless interfaces and things like that, doesn't come close to identifying the most critical vulnerabilities. And as we've organized the work, we're going to be stepping through here almost in reverse order of the level of threat or concern that we have in these areas, because we're starting with the more traditional areas. But I think a conclusion is that the biggest security open doors, if you will, are the ones that are not in the traditional areas of FCC, control and influence, and that by no means means that the FCC can't play a very constructive role in these. What it means is that we have to work hard to come up with practical approaches where the FCC can take leadership roles, catalyst roles, and things like that. But we've broken the work down into 4 areas. They are the cellular network itself and end-user security and privacy related to cellular networks, network integrity related to cellular, but probably also applies to Wi-Fi networks. The third area is related to Wi-Fi security, and the fourth area has to do with devices and apps. So those are the four, and I think if I could, roughly equate them in terms of priority, they're in escalating priority as you step through the four. So with that, I'm not going to spend much time on the preliminaries here because the chairman's time is very short. But let me suffice to say that the mobile security environment, in fact, the wireless ecosystem itself, as I think everyone here probably appreciates, is quite complex and it's very diverse. A lot of different players, a lot of different parts. Many of those players are industries that have very different cultures from each other. Cellular networks versus consumer electronics, for instance, everything in between. And that and many of the trends that we see with, certainly cell phone penetration, increasing, mobile commerce with these devices, with the explosion of apps, many other things that are listed on this slide, when taken in combination of that complexity and the trends, that makes for an environment of even more, more concern, more need to take actions. But the actions have to do it in the context of looking at the whole ecosystem and not just zooming in on one particular part. So that's kind of part of the message here, is that some of the things that most need to be done are going to be some of the ones maybe most challenging, I think, for the FCC to get their oar in the water, but very, very important to do so. So a few upfront kind of guiding observations that was the essence of a lot of the work in our team. Some of the things I'd already mentioned, but the diversity of the environment also, leads to what's a rather uneven and ultimately, insecure, vulnerable security and privacy environment. There are a lot of security mechanisms in place, and there's a lot of great work going on in many different places, but it's not all pulled together in one nice, neat, cohesive whole. And unfortunately, as a result, there's no silver bullet answers here. We're not going to come up with something that's going to solve it, and I don't think anyone here expected that. It's important to recognize that whatever is done is going to require multi-layer defenses at multiple layers in the protocol stack, if you will, and it's going to require multifaceted approaches to closing the largest security gaps. And I don't think I'm saying anything surprising with those comments. But given the environment, given those kinds of challenges, it was very strong consensus, in our group that it's really collaborative leading to voluntary measures which are going to be the most effective in this environment. It's a very fast-paced environment. The innovation, both for good and for bad, is extremely rapid. And the only way to deal with a rapid threat environment is to have a very agile community working together and communicating together. And we think sort of top-down control methods, regulatory methods and things like that may have their place, but for the most part here are going to be more secondary to indirect influence and catalyst roles and partnering arrangements with industry groups and other government groups. So I'm going to go through the four areas. I'm not going to spend too much time on the first slides. They're a bit of an eye test. I'm going to spend most of the time in the recommendations for the four areas. In the cellular area, I think the threats that really bubbled up for us in this area had to do with 2G GSM. The older cellular technologies, not surprisingly, are less secure. And because of the very large legacy, both infrastructure and devices that are out there, it's not something that you can kind of go and just fix. But you can mitigate this with techniques. So if I go to the next slide on the recommendations in this area. I think that we rely in this area as much as anything on educational methods to increase people's awareness. I think most people are not really thinking of their device is a 2G, 3G, 4G device, and when it's tuned into 2G, maybe you're roaming internationally or whatever, you're not nearly as secure as you would be on a 3G or 4G network. They've gotten progressively more secure. But 2G, GSM kind of stands out as less secure. But there are, if you can't go back economically and fix the network, you can at least put some mechanisms in place that would give people more control over when they would use 2G in their network. And it's sort of the same thing to some degree with SMS as well. It's not as secure as you might like. And informing people of the need for caution, what they send in their SMS messages and things like that is an important thing for making them safer. So I'm going to step into the second area, which is still cellular, but it's related to the network integrity. In other words, attacks against the network or services themselves. So we're going to talk a lot about malware, both here and later in the presentation. The threat, the amount of malware that is out there has been increasing. I hate to use the word exponentially, but one interesting data point from the Juniper study, second half of last year, was a 33% increase in mobile malware on the Android platform. So, and you see a lot of other data with similarly large step-ups in the volume. Malware is being manufactured by cloning other apps and installing malware in the apps and things. So, they're also becoming more sophisticated as they go on, and malware represents a threat both to the end user but also to the networks because of the potential for coordinated attacks against the network. This can attack the capacity of the network, a classical denial of service attack, more specialized attacks against, say the signaling infrastructure of wireless networks, which can cripple a wireless network. And also very alarmingly, it can be directed against emergency services of many types and overwhelm both people and systems with the volume. And I think if you also look at the expected increase in number of endpoints of machine to machine, and you also understand that a large portion of the machine to machine modules out there are 2G based, so there's more potential here for very high volume attacks as the volume of machine to machine grows to kind of fill its potential. And this is concerning because it's the volume attacks really that can bring networks down. So I'm a little behind on advancing my slides. Sorry about that. So the recommendations in the network integrity space. Here, the wireless operators are already doing a lot, spending a lot. They're doing a lot in this area. And for good reason. It's in their best interest. Every time there's a problem related to malware, it's additional cost. They're the ones who are called first. They're very motivated to do everything they can to mitigate this. What we think is that it's in the communication between operators and the government, where more robust mechanisms and also ones that are free from concern about legal ramifications, sort of addressing the privacy concerns of sharing security event information. I think this is an area that will greatly increase the ability of operators to detect and isolate malware. And will also facilitate a government response where that's necessary. But it needs to be done in an environment where all the impediments to that kind of free and clear communication are removed. This may be an area where the FCC can take maybe more direct action. Another area that we see as a strong value here would be a process, a better, more timely process for operators, but also other stakeholders in the community to request that malware apps be removed from application stores. So if this can be done in a timely way, in an organized fashion, you can get malware, out of the system sooner rather than later and reduce the spread. So this is a valuable area to try and make something happen. There are many other malware-related aspects, but most of those are covered in the last section. The third area relates to Wi-Fi security. And Wi-Fi hotspots was what we primarily focused on. It's a very open and diverse environment, sort of by definition, because you want public to be able to access it. And it's used, of course, very extensively. Everyone with a smartphone is using Wi-Fi, and increasingly, as you have shared data plans, you're encouraged to use Wi-Fi even more. So, but on the other hand, the tools that are out there for snooping and Wi-Fi, for masquerading as a real Wi-Fi access point, but really being a rogue one, it's clearly a weak point in the system, and it relates very closely to your cellular subscription, but you're using the Wi-Fi on the same device. So it's very much part of that, very closely tied into that ecosystem. So recommendations in this space. The Wi-Fi industry is doing quite a lot to address security issues and bring Wi-Fi security up to the level of the newer cellular technologies. Did I go backwards? Sorry. Thank you. And I think this represents a great example of a building block that can be used to make Wi-Fi more secure. That, what the Wi-Fi Alliance is doing by itself is not enough, but it forms a great building block to build upon, improving the authentication, improving the encryption to cellular standards in the Wi-Fi space, and maybe even more important, creating mechanisms to make the use of these security capabilities much more automatic, much more likely to be adopted by consumers. This is really key. It's hard to secure consumers because their patience and appetite for anything security, or even their awareness of the vulnerabilities, is all very low. And so we think what they've done is innovative. You can build on those concepts. It needs to be taken farther. It needs to be extended, as is being done in industry bodies now, security in a roaming sense between Wi-Fi and cellular providers. There's more to be done there, and I think that's a very fruitful way. The other thing is the Wi-Fi Alliance has used a sort of a branding and certification approach, so we think we can extend those concepts more broadly. We feel that the power of a branding approach, both to educate consumers in a simple way and also incent the various industry players, creating the hardware and software and security features in the network, can be very powerful. So a branding approach is probably not an FCC brand, right? But the FCC could play a role in getting industry players together. Maybe there are nonprofits, existing industry groups that could own the branding mechanism. But all of these things require some kind of a business model to support them. But we think that that's a very fruitful area for securing what is a significant vulnerability area in mobile security today. So just to kind of lay an example, sometimes an example is illustrative. If you walk into your coffee shop and you pull out your favorite device, your iPad, you see on there's an icon that represents that you're on a secure Wi-Fi, whatever the branding is, and that you've been authenticated. You've got encryption running through your cellular provider, or maybe you're using credentials from your social media site. And these are all things that some of the building blocks to build on top of are already in place and can be used, but it's not widely adopted yet. So if I move on to the fourth and final of the four areas, we grouped devices and apps together, and this really is the most important area. It's also the most challenging of the areas. Smart devices are very rich targets when you think about all the information that's on them and how they're used. Very rich, and with more and more use cases and models and the development of more modes of mobile commerce, they are just going to get richer and richer as targets. And where the targets are rich, so are the bad actors. And you have an app environment. I think we all know there's tens of thousands of app developers out there. It's a very open and diverse kind of environment. I kind of think of it as the opposite end of the spectrum from the cellular environment, where things are sort of buttoned down and controlled, and in the app environment, it's kind of the opposite of that. Now, tremendous power from that. Our economy is benefiting great from all that kind of innovation. But how do you make such an environment secure? I think when I think of all the areas that we're working on, and I think about how big the barn door is open, right? I think this is the area that rises to the top for our work group. And I think of it, if I had malintent, right? Where would I invest my time to exploit the system? This is the space I would probably most focus on to exploit. Another way of looking at it is, many of these other security areas that we're talking about, if you think of them in combination with malware, that's where the real power is. So if you've got an unsecured 2G, you've got an unsecured Wi-Fi, or you're planning an attack against the network or emergency services, all of these things are likely to be done in conjunction with malware. But malware is kind of at the center of it. So recommendations in this area include things like mechanisms for, or more established mechanisms for app certification or whitelisting, if you prefer that term, so that users, consumers have some level of confidence. Maybe it's even a tiered structure for different levels of scrutiny of the devices, of the applications, but that users have a good housekeeping seal of approval, if you will, that this is an app that's gone through a certain amount of checking. Now, there are a lot of apps out there. That's not a cheap thing to do. It's not an easy thing to institute, right? It's a really important thing. In general, malware screening, in general, probably needs to be done at a number of places. This is a role that the government could take an active role or encourage the establishment of, let's say, nonprofits that would do this. The operators have a vested interest in keeping malware off of their network and off of the devices on their network. So they have mechanisms ready to in their network and sometimes in the devices to detect these things. And all of these mechanisms together need to be brought to bear to identify and try and root out as much of the malware as possible. But it's a big battle given the volume and how it's growing. How rapidly it's growing in size and scale. Other areas that I think are useful for additional work is in the area of app permission models. We've had a lot of discussion in our group about how inadequate application permission models are today. They're generally don't have enough granularity and pop up frequently, and users, consumers get tired of them and just flip through. They don't very well characterize some of the things that are happening, which is sort of app permission escalation, where one application, a string of these seemingly innocent app permissions that you've granted now releases your whole contact list to someone you never intended it to go to, or worse. In the area of device OS APIs, this is also an area where I would say the industry is sort of uneven here. Some devices are more secure than others. And surely there's more that could be done to secure those that are less secure. Also build on top of existing initiatives. NIST has guidelines for the enterprise having to do with bring your own device usage, and this is an important area because of the extra openings, if you will, portals into enterprises through the use of mixed-use consumer and enterprise devices. So with that, our next steps are really to take these lists of things which we consider priority areas needing to be addressed, and to sort of form an aligned opinion within the work group and in working with the FCC and other industry groups about which of these would be practical to address with some type of a partnering arrangement that the FCC could lead or catalyze. So we still have more work to do here in turning these into, I would say, a little bit more targeted, just maybe a subset of these, targeted and actionable action items. But we do firmly believe that these are the, if you want to make a difference in mobile security, these are the these are the key areas to focus on. Thank you.
Thank you. Let me first of all thank you and the group that worked on this. It's extremely helpful, and I want to thank all of you for the discussion you're about to have. This is, as we all know, incredibly important and timely. I was glad to hear what you said at the end, which I heard as rapid next steps to drive to actionable steps quickly. So thank you for that. It is important. We have in the past, and we will together with you use the different tools we have to move, as you're suggesting, from talking about the issues to doing something about them. It's hard to identify things that are more important. So thank you for that. I really wish I could stay, and I'm looking forward to the report. I encourage you to have a real healthy dialogue about this, both about what you have in here, but also about how can we quickly move to action steps, what are the priority action steps. Let's get going, and let's not wait till the next meeting necessarily to start moving on pieces of it that everyone can agree, you know what, we should do this now. So thank you all very much, and I'll be back.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thanks for teeing this up and giving us such a great example of low-hanging fruit to deal with here. Let me, Kevin, you and your group, it's a great job, and you clearly have identified the issues and identified what needs to get done. Let me see if I can pick up on what the chairman was talking about insofar as okay and therefore, which is, I think, what he just said our mandate was. There are conflicting forces inherent in your report. You've got the conflict that regulation is inherently unflexible in an environment in which flexibility is everything and technology is changing rapidly. Dissonance. You've got the reality that there is a level of consumer ignorance and a feeling of a lack of necessity to act, yet a big problem. And you've got the reality that voluntary standards are not quick to develop either, and tend to produce something in the denominator which heads towards lowest common denominator. And all of those conflict with the overall goal of how do you provide security and privacy. All he's asking us to do is to figure out how to resolve those conflicts. But seriously, this is wow, how you grab a hold of this. What are the thoughts around the table as to how we do this? Because leaving those conflicts sitting out there in the middle of the room is just an invitation for disaster. And we all know how mobile has become, particularly one mobile platform has become the avenue of choice for bad guys. What do we do about it?
And we very, very much welcome inputs and ideas from the whole group. That's why we're here.
Let's not everybody raise their hand and say, oh, there's a 3-point plan that we have to adopt here all at once.
Well, Tom?
Yeah.
One of the things we've learned over and over again is that these extremely high-quality network intrusion and security firms that are basically doing this all day long don't seem to have particularly strong relationships.
Well, we got some. Peter, yeah, you get close.
Sorry, my apologies. No, all I was going to say was, if you look at some of the most recent breaches and who actually detected them first, generally they tended to be very high quality but focused security researchers. And I guess my question is whether the FCC has some role in building a coalition and a tighter relationship with those very specific providers in this area. All the network providers are working with individual firms. But the idea of some kind of coalition or working group around that issue with those, and they're easy to find, there are about 10 of them, right. I think would probably help point us in a really good direction in that, to help us potentially resolve some of those conflicts that you described.
So, we had the idea last year, which the Commission is still working on, of a dig once database, if you will, where we would put on the web, here's where we're about to dig, and folks could coordinate. What if there were appropriately secured, for want of another term, a clean room, where this kind of information with appropriate privacy protections could be exchanged, and that could be sponsored by this agency? Is that I think
that's certainly one way. Of course, the great concern, law enforcement has done that in a number of occasions, but the question is whether, in fact, it is secure and will never get out in the public domain if the government.
And so here we go back into the difficulties with how you achieve something.
But maybe, I don't know, I'll turn to Milo, who has more expertise in this. Do you think CERT works as a mechanism for? That's a nonprofit Carnegie Mellon mechanism, but does that work for disseminating some of this information in a more effective way than each individual trying to do it with individual counterparties?
I think in general, it does take a lot of people talking in to add value to what's done in kind of bi-directional ways. The challenge is how to come up with something that doesn't create more trouble than it's worth, either from the perspective of privacy issues or other sets of things that compromise the effectiveness at the group level. And I think, that's something that the industry has struggled with. I don't know that there are any kind of rocket science solutions here, given the current set of regs.
Okay, Dave, and then Shahid.
I think when you talk about the high-quality security professionals, there are lots of ways that they've learned how to talk to each other because they've developed that kind of trust. And I think that part of the problem here is as you add sort of institutional overhead to the conversation, people's willingness to talk goes down. I think there are a lot of venues in which these conversations occur, and I think the The interesting question is when you look at the mobile space in particular, does it seem that there's a lack of conversation, I would say not among the security professionals, but along the value chain, the handset developers, the protocol developers, the base station developers. And then I think the question is, what role does the FCC play? It's going to be, if there's a role, it's going to be a facilitating, cheerleading, you're not talking to him, why not kind of role. But the point is the ecosystem is rich in venues that may or may not serve a purpose. And I think it's important to understand that when the government comes in, it brings its own institutional character. And certainly a lot of the groups like, anti-abuse and so forth, which is not mobile, but part of the reasons they function is because they are bottom-up, self-defined. You're in the room because I trust you. I mean, I've had a grad student go to one of those meetings, and he was personally vetted by using a sort of a social network test. It was quite funny, actually. So I think there is a question of what's your strength and what's your weakness as a government organization. I don't think I can't fully answer that, but that's really the key question to ask, which is what role should the FCC play in this really rich space?
Yep. Shahid.
Tom, no, just adding on to the same conversation about sharing information. I know from a enterprise perspective, there's regularly all kinds of hacks happening in companies, but none of it really gets reported. And there's some vital information in that that without the exchange of and sharing of this information, it's very difficult to come up with a solution, particularly around Wi-Fi, that we're just beginning to see just a slew of attacks coming through on the enterprise space. So that's something, I know you're working on, but, I like the idea of the clean room. I like an idea of where companies can come in and share this data and be able to, tactically address those problems.
Sure.
I do a lot of work with the startup community, and there's a lot of innovation in this area in particular. There's quite a number of entrepreneurial companies, individuals trying to do this stuff. It seems like we could try to think of ways that the FCC could spark innovation or help, contribute to innovation. Things like the X Prize sort of model, are the things that we can do that get even more entrepreneurs focused on this.
So let's address. That's a really good point. Let's address that because
a lot of us around the room are in working with the startup company world as well, and there is definitely not a shortage of folks with ideas for solutions. But there is, at least in my experience, a shortage of a market for them, of a sense of urgency and immediacy that would create a market. There's plenty of opportunity to, let's test this, let's study this, let's think about this, but there's not a sense of urgency. There's not a, hello, you got to wake up and do something about this. Is there a role that can be played? How would you overcome that to provide the marketplace stimulus for the kind of idea you're talking about?
And that's a really good question, and it might be where, because of the leverage we have with the carriers or with the OEMs in this group, we could help stimulate that market, that perhaps winning ideas get an option to be built into the standard build of Android or get a standard, I'm just making things up here, but are there ways that we could help incentivize that adoption of some of these new technologies?
Okay. Adam, and then Mark.
So, I think, Tom, I'd say the first thing is really acknowledging the seriousness of the problem. But the second is to take a look at the mobile world and look at what actually happened in static networks with PCs, servers, things of that sort. And, basically you find at the heart of it a very deep technical problem, and that is how do we secure operating systems in the first place? Okay? And as long as that technical problem exists, I think the vulnerability vector will continue to exist. So I've heard ideas all the way from, how do you try to do deep security for everybody, or just segregate things so there are good neighborhoods and bad neighborhoods where you operate. Okay? And just like that static world, you do find a number of enterprises, whether it's Symantec, whether it's McAfee, that really dominate the space, and the consumers are on their own as to the protection that they actually buy. Okay? Yeah. I'm not quite sure that an institutional solution is necessarily the right answer here.
Okay. Yeah. Mark?
Tom, I thought your question was really spot on. And I do think it's partially tied up in this whole notion of a certification process, and I think that's going to, in the end, going to be the core, the crux of what we'll have to wrestle with or not wrestle with, which is there a role for the government and is there a role for the FCC to play in sort of minimal level certification hurdles that you have to go over to put an app, out there? If you do, then that's going to spawn a number of vendors that are going to want to come forward to create security solutions or help people create security solutions for applications that are being developed.
So are you saying that in the FCC's device certification program, there should be something addressing security?
I'm not making the judgment call as to whether or not the FCC should go that far, but what I'm saying is that if you're trying to spur vendors to create solutions to help people secure apps, then having some minimal level of certification is going to spawn that industry.
Okay. I keep looking at Brian down here, figuring he's going to put his card up any second here. But Charlotte, and then we'll.
I think part of the challenge is that when you talk about, Symantec or McAfee, the problem is that you identify the risk and then they find a solution. And the question is, can we be more proactive in that space? Mm-hmm. And I think one of the things that Mark is actually saying is not necessarily, is there an opportunity for a solution that essentially says, I'm going to beat this thing to death. I'm going to beat this application to death. I'm going to look for every single hole, every single cranny that I could potentially get into to create a problem. But I see part of the challenge, for us is that many times we all hit that problem, and then we're basically waiting for Symantec or McAfee to come up with, and they do very quickly. Mm-hmm. They come up with an answer, but you may have had, your servers going up and down, and because of some little malware that was there.
Right. And if I can, just for a second to finish on that, there may be an opportunity to just shine the light on the problems, as Charlotte's saying, as opposed to enforce the solutions, which is to say that if there could be a clearinghouse where all these problems come together so that everybody sees them, that might spur vendors to come out there to be able to show how they can fix them.
Okay. Kevin, Brian, and then we'll take it back to Kevin.
If there's a hope there, I think your only hope really is in the branding space, which maybe is what Mark was just referring to at the very end there. I think notions that somehow you're going to create certification mechanisms or government mechanisms that are going to somehow be silver bullet forcing functions, just, quite honestly, ain't going to happen, guys. And I don't even think the FCC has the legal jurisdiction to go in that direction, although I'm certainly not a lawyer, nor do I play one at this table. But there is quite a lot of power in branding, though, and we've seen that. That if you can establish a consumer expectation about an icon or a brand or some other sort of thing, that there's some power in that. So in a convening sense, can you get the industry to kind of coalesce around a small number of brands? Perhaps that would help. I mean, brands are only as powerful as their focus. So, having 17 brands for, security is probably useless, because nobody will pay any attention, right? If there was a way to get something that said, hey, if you look for this mark, you have the following kinds of confidence assurances, et cetera, and there's somebody that stands behind it, because brands also, if you think about branding, there's something, there might be some hope there. But I just think, as soon as the discussion veers into the space of, let's create regulatory structures to force things, I just think, we're wasting our time. It ain't going there.
The Intel Inside solution has just been proposed. Brian?
That worked very well for us, and it worked. Brands have worked for other people.
It worked.
I mean, they're real solutions. To these kinds of.
I'm just pulling your
things. Yeah, I know.
I think Kevin pretty well echoed most of my comments I was going to say. I think if we talk about certification, device certification, that's a difficult path, I believe, for this issue. Many of these threats are not a device issue itself. It's in the application space, outside of the device. So I'm not sure how you would fit device certification in with application malware and certify. It doesn't work.
That's the problem with this whole thing. And Kevin, you get to solve this. I mean, look at all these solutions that you've just been given.
Yes. I do appreciate all the comments. I think there's some good ones that came out that I hadn't heard before, which are really good. I heard some other ones which are kind of in line with, I think, what we're recommending in the types of approaches. So certainly let me leave the offer open as you think about this, especially when you're using your mobile device and you're worried about keeping it secure, as we all are. Please send us, your ideas, or call us up, and because this is going to require creative approaches, and I think the branding one is a creative approach. I think there's some of these other things that we have here are mechanisms that aren't in place today, but the more creative forces we have going towards this, the better off we will be. And we will be spending a good portion of the last phase of the year's work on trying to winnow through the practical ways to implement many of these proposals. So please engage with us.
Yeah, Peter.
Quick suggestion, Kevin. So a number of other government agencies, the SEC, the Federal Reserve, and others, are, with all due respect, because I happen to agree with you, but they are mandating certain things within their businesses. Banks have certain requirements now that the FCC has mandated, security firms, the SEC. It might be helpful to try and just see what some other government agencies are doing in this domain to see if we can maybe steal some good ideas.
Yeah, it's a great idea. Yeah. Okay, Nomi and Russ. The Nomi and Russ show.
Yep. Russ is going to lead us on this one. Russ and John Barnhill.
Okay, so this is what we did on our summer vacation. So we focused on two issues: voice over IP interconnect, which I'm going to pass the ball to John Barnhill after I cover databases. But we talked about the database transition as it relates to the sunset of the PSTN, so to speak. So here's our team. This is Group A, or otherwise known as the A team. We've got some great folks on here, industry expertise. I also want to call out a special thank you to Hala Malfi. I apologize about your name, Hala. Hala's in the back there. She was tremendously useful in terms of our database issue and some of the discussions. Hala works for Telcordia, which is one of the biggest database companies. So the questions for our group really were centered around, need the clicker. You could. What legacy databases need to transition to the future all IP environment? And the second question was really around, are we already there? We're on next steps. That's not us. Yeah.
Russ, we give it to you. It was in fine working order when we turned it over to you.
It was thrown once. It's completely out of my control. Yeah. Let's see.
You're going crazy here. So don't malware.
Malware, exactly.
Yeah, we're not queued up.
Yeah.
We're queued up.
Who's got the presentation?
Jeff? Slides?
Okay,
there we go.
Let me just get you.
Is that us? No, that's wireless. No. We are PSTN transition. Okay. Anyway, I'll cover the two questions. As I said, which legacy databases will need to transition to an all IP environment? And the second question, how will databases that are essential to the PSTN as we know it today need to evolve? So our readout, we did a review of all the relevant databases. This is not, well, it was fairly comprehensive. We came up with about 18 databases, catching up here, 18 databases that we felt were relevant in terms of what's currently existing. There's quite a few more if you look at some of the internal databases that service providers use today. We also came up with 6 next-generation databases that are existing. Again, there's more than 6, but they were the ones that were relevant. All these are attached in the appendix, by the way. We did a creation of a database matrix, and we also did an analysis by function type and the importance today, during the transition and post-transition. So with that in mind, we also coordinated with Group B, which Brian will talk about some of the work going on in Group B with numbering identifiers and so forth. And we started some initial work with the M2M group, and there's probably more work that needs to be done there, identifying what other issues will come up from M2M perspective. So the actions between now and December, at least this is the readout right now, we need to finalize that matrix reference list that we have, creation of a transition roadmap with regard to some of the existing and new databases, and at that point deliver the final recommendation to the TAC. So here's the industry position, or news, so to speak. The good thing is there are a limited number of databases to consider. There's also really a limited number of vendors that offer these databases today, with a large number of SPs that work with those databases. There's greater potential in terms of service support and reuse in the post-transition all-IP environment, and there's general agreement that the market will drive most of these needed updates in the databases that are out there. In other words, the market will force these databases to change with the transition. There is a need for standardization on a global basis, though, which is going to be a little bit more difficult to drive. And the need to investigate the potential of a location database. This is something we've identified as next-gen or future database, and I'll give some more details in a moment. I'm sorry, I'm not keeping up with the clicker. You up there? Okay. So the top 4 databases, yeah, this is an eye test. Come on, you're right there. That's as good as it gets. So the top really 3 or 4 databases we identified were the Line Information Database, or LIDB. We're not going to go, I won't read this slide because it is very verbose. The toll-free database, and the ENUM, which is also short for enumeration database, which is basically the telephone number mapping, which is fairly critical. And then, as I mentioned, the telephone database, or the location database. So these are the ones that we will be working on or focusing on over the next 3 months until December. So the potential recommendations and steps, we look at the FCC to work with international regulators and partners on a transition plan that has least impact in terms of database workarounds or requirements. This thing needs to be automatic. In terms of backwards compatibility. Look at the emergency services database as a good example of some of the NG work that's been done to date. They've really done a good job. And there's a potential here for the FCC to establish milestones and a schedule if they want to really sort of incentivize or move this forward quicker. And the next step we'll have is a joint session with Team A and B on the database impact to numbering and identifier, which the numbering and identifiers are a critical issue in terms of what happens with databases. How identifiers evolve, which Brian will talk more about, is something we have to have up front to figure that one out. Further investigation on the location needs. This is somewhat critical. We were looking at it from the aspect of eliminating some of the spoofing concerns, need for geolocation updates for some of the databases, and potentially how identity is determined. Location may relate to identity as it does today in the PSTN. A number typically maps to an address. And there's also some issues around location for the emergency services. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to John Barnhill, who's going to talk about the interconnect topic.
Okay. All right. The VoIP interconnection subgroup has been working through this basically since we were assigned this at the beginning of the year. The questions that we were assigned are listed, and we have drafted responses to these questions with a variety of inputs, including members on the committee, plus Addis has provided us some support there. And then the last bullet, we were to deliver a detailed matrix of technical issues that need to be worked, and that is almost complete, and we just got our last inputs last week, so we're on target to deliver that by the December meeting. As far as the readout from the where we are now, we've worked with every member of the committee that is part of a service provider to sound out the various issues and the various goals that each would have in this area. We've assembled a number of interconnect scenarios that we drew up and have reviewed those with a number of people, including Addis. We've coordinated, because there's so much interdependency between the interconnect scenarios, the identifiers, and the databases. We brought those people into our discussion as well to talk about the implications that those different areas would have on interconnection. And then as of late, we also added scenarios where we would demonstrate how over-the-tops would come in and interconnect with the service provider network or managed IP networks that are part of what we see the new network becoming. And then, as all issues have not been totally agreed between the participants, we were asked to draft a memo outlining the positions that are represented on the working group, and so we've drafted that. So we have a number of items that we're going to finish for the next meeting, which we will deliver the matrix. We're going to deliver the final scrubbed issues and our final recommendations. So that's the work that's proceeded so far. So what did we find when we went through all that? Well, number one, there is good news here. And the good news is that there's a general alignment around where the future network is going to go, particularly for the service providers, which this new network becomes a collection of managed IP networks delivering very high-quality services across those networks. Generally, when the various participants described how they would like to see this roll out, there was a general feeling that in a perfect world, you'd prefer a free market solution for this versus a regulated solution. And we'll talk more about that in a second. The other good news is that there is progress being made. There are communities of interest that are aligning around standards and are interconnecting their voice traffic via IP. So we see that the technology is becoming proven. It is feasible, it is doable, and there is progress not only in the United States but in other countries. The not so good news is that the major point that we were unable to resolve, and there was even debate about, since this is not a technical issue, whether it should be brought up, and strong feelings on both sides of that. But it comes down to, should Section 251 in the Telecom Act apply to the definition of this interconnect, with typically the larger service providers asserting that we shouldn't apply those types of restrictions associated with that have traditionally been associated with TDM traffic with IP services, while others have said that the Telecom Act is technology neutral, and hence interconnection rights that are specified in Section 251 should also apply and be extended to VoIP interconnect agreements. So we have not been able to resolve that, and we do not believe we will be able to resolve those two fundamental differences in position. And that takes us to our potential recommendations, and that is the working group will note that the Commission needs to resolve the fundamental question around Section 251 applicability. And regardless of how that gets interpreted, the group feels very strongly that the guiding principle here should be a technology-neutral position that encourages innovation going forward. And then finally, as a final recommendation, as other countries are somewhat ahead of us in this curve, it might be useful to examine some of the policies that other countries have implemented. And we list here Canada as an example because theirs was last year, to show how they are triggering and determining the requirements for this. So that's where we've gotten with this working group. And as I say, from this point on, we'll be working on the technical side and delivering the matrix. But in terms of any other discussion about next steps, they sort of depend on this particular issue.
Thank you, John. Let me come right to you. Let me just see if I can clarify one thing. We were actually talking about this, Kevin and Dennis and I, at lunch in a not this specific issue, but the gentlemen were commenting how this TAC has been different than other TACs. And the reason is because of the charge that we were given by the chairman at the outset to come back and make recommendations. And specifically, we were given a list of things, not all of which were technical. Mm-hmm. You know, how to use technology to regulatory authority to create jobs is not a technical issue. The kinds of things that we came back with saying we need to have an executive order on antenna siting and access to federal buildings is not a technical issue. So I don't think that, I believe that specifically our mandate, although our term is the Technological Council, our mandate is beyond, or need not be limited by, this isn't about bits and bytes or megahertz or dB or whatever the case may be in terms of the technical issues. That doesn't help you resolve the issue, and I understand the issue, but it is, probably ought to provide an overall construct.
Thank you.
For us. Kevin.
That's on or not. You went out of your way to talk about managed IP networks. What's the role of over-the-top providers that are not operating on a managed IP network in this?
We're actually going to talk about that a bit more in the QoS section that comes up in the next group. And that's been discussed a number of times, but the initial scope of this had to do with interconnecting service providers. And so to the extent that we've gone beyond that now, it was to define, the current interconnect scheme for interfacing with basically an E.164 network. And the next phase was to define how that would work in an all-IP world, how that would have to come into the network. And we basically have diagrammed it. We've run it by a number of industry participants who are part of that. And but that's about all we've done to this point is done the scenario planning for it, outlined some of the issues that would have to be dealt with in terms of QoS around it, but that's it so far.
Yeah, I guess I'm just a little bit concerned that as we lay down track here for what the future might look like, it may well be dominated by managed IP, and that's fine if it is. But I don't want the way in which we ask questions today here and for the FCC to ask questions to essentially create an architectural implication about what that means. And I would hope that there would be no architectural difference in terms of the interconnect structures between a managed IP network and a non-managed IP network, because the ultimate protocols are the same running up top. I mean, the management is about the, whether you're doing something special in the pipes. And we can argue till the cows come home. In fact, the internet community has argued for years about whether we need to do something at that level or not. But I don't want architecturally for us to preclude one class of interconnect versus the other. So that's the only thing I'd say is as we frame these things, let's just be careful about creating what appear to be special positions for certain kind of interconnect unless they are architecturally significant. And here I don't think
specifically, though, we did define that there were, depending on your approach to this, there were a number of ways to interconnect, and that you could expect two service providers connecting physical facilities that are fully controlled end-to-end might have a different quality of service.
Sure, no,
than others.
no question about that.
But there was a provision made for each type of interconnection, whether it was public or private, and to an attempt to characterize how that would work in those circumstances.
Yeah, and I'm fine with that. It's just, as an industry, we have been remarkably poor at projecting what consumers actually want. I mean, we for a long time in the industry, right, we projected that what consumers wanted was crystal clear call quality, that was over and above everything else. And then we discovered that ratty cell phones were much more preferable to pin drops. So I just want to make sure that we do not project an architecture that somehow tries to shape a future versus accommodate a likely future, but accommodate unlikely futures as well.
Right.
That's all.
Ready cell phones. That's a technical term. Are we back to the technology? We're going to go this way. We're going to go Tony, okay, Dave, Casey, Walt, Marvin, right this way.
Tom, I respect your position, and I think you're right that the framework of this TAC has often led to recommendations that were not purely technical in nature. I think the difference here is that there has been plenty of dialogue and debate and input from all the constituents on this particular issue about 251, 252 applicability, and I don't believe there's anything that this TAC will add to that debate that hasn't already been said. And I think we, in the interest of productively utilizing the time of the folks on this committee, rehashing what's already in front of the FCC doesn't, to me, is not a good use of the committee's time. So that's the only point I'll make on that. The second thing I'll say is there is some debate on this issue of whether or not the issue that we just talked about is what is stifling movement towards effective IP interconnection, and I would argue that, as was said earlier, the technological piece is pretty clear, and I think the industry understands the various ways to do it, and things are progressing. I think we need to acknowledge that, in my opinion, one of the most fundamental reasons why things haven't progressed as much, and in the view of the large carriers and their involvement in this, is that the large carriers had a very, very few of our customers on IP. And so our interest in terms of moving aggressively towards IP interconnection was really more triggered from the fact that we have 95%, 99% more legacy-based customers. That obviously is changing for all of us, and with that is a change of eagerness and assertiveness to go ahead and establish these interconnection agreements, both technical and from a commercial business standpoint. And I think you will see this issue progress rapidly over the next few years. And I'm fearful that a decision we make on the regulatory environment to try to solve something that's perceived to have been caused by this may actually have much more serious negative ramifications for the Internet in general going forward.
Well, it always has been. It's valid points. It always has been the difficult job of this agency as to where to draw the dotted line to cut the baby in half amongst the competitors. Casey.
One is that you mentioned a memo in the slides about that outlines where parties are aligned and misaligned, and I wondered, first of all, is that memo going to be shared? I'd be interested in reading it. But the only slide I saw in misalignment was this 251 thing. Is that the only real issue where there's misalignment among the stakeholders?
The others are in details that are easily worked out, in my opinion, via bilateral agreement.
Okay.
Or else the industry as a large could make some additional refinements to standards. But
that's interesting.
That's the primary issue that came up between the various participants.
You plan to make the memo available or some form of it in the final report?
I think you were sent a draft.
Oh, okay. I didn't see it. I'll go look.
Let's just check. Did folks get it? Okay, so we don't have to send it out again?
Walter sent it out last Thursday.
Oh, okay.
Oh, but Walter's got the Keep Casey Off
Walter sends me different mail entirely.
You're on the B list.
Yeah, indeed. Second question, the Canadian example, I didn't quite get what Canada's doing. I agree that other countries would be extremely helpful. I found them quite helpful in the reasonable network management dialogue of what is Japan doing in particular. But one, are there any other countries we can draw on? And two, what actually is Canada doing?
Yeah, they just created a series of criteria that would create a hard trigger for when IP Interconnect had to be offered.
Okay.
And there's a number of criteria, and then they also established a response date by which the two carriers should have an agreement. So it just basically says, here's when you do it, and here's how long you have to work it out once we say that it's good to go.
So I think it's a great recommendation to have the FCC go research this. Are there any other resources you're aware of looking at what other countries are doing? Or really, most countries have not had this conversation yet, I would assume.
A lot have not, but there is information on other countries available through various forums.
Okay.
That we could bring in.
Okay. Thanks.
We've looked at a number of different reports on this, but it just varies per every jurisdiction.
Well, okay, I'm basically going to amplify something Casey just said. That first of all, you did a great job. I read through the reports. I read your memo, and there's a wealth of information, and also in the supplementary material that you have. Two things in terms of where I sit that would interest me. One is certainly where we're falling behind, and the touchstone there, I think, is across the globe where other people are moving ahead of us in this area. The other thing, and I think Kevin touched on this, is where things are inhibiting progress being made. So you talk about 16 databases. Most of those have stakeholders. They're advancing. The interest here would be where we think there might be jeopardy issues, where we think the changes are occurring fast enough to allow the progress to continue. So when you produce your final report, look at it not only in terms of a compendium, but things that ought to be highlighted as special concern.
Okay. Great. Marvin.
Yeah, one of the following up on one of the things that Kevin was talking about of trying to make sure that we deal with public IP as well as managed IP is a possibility that in reading the rules one ends up with a different regime or a different applicability of 251 for managed IP than for unmanaged IP, and if that happens, we're going to create an incentive for different arrangements, and that would be very bad.
Okay. Yeah. Russ?
I just wanted to thank the team as one of the chairs. This is a very contentious issue, and we've had a couple calls that I would just say were interesting, but I just want to say I think that really, really happy with the team because very professional discussion, and I think it was said we really didn't unearth anything new, but I think the good thing was, and Casey called it out, that I think there was mostly, in general, good agreement. So from a TAC perspective, I think we've answered the technical questions that were laid out to us. And I'm not sure there's much more we can do as a team, but I just want to thank the team for all their hard work and doing it in a civilized way.
Have you thought about selling the movie rights to the client?
Well, you missed our last slide. We were going to bring him in to moderate.
All right, Brian, Team B.
John.
I won't throw it.
Thank you. Well done, Kevin.
Thanks, and I guess we're the sequel to your movie, Russ, but we've had equally interesting discussions, I should say, on our topics. Both the quality of service identifiers certainly were up there, and even the robustness of public safety were three areas of real heavy debate and discussion, and a lot of good work by the team. If we could have the slides, please.
Oh, there he is.
All right, we'll move to the next slide. Thanks.
That is the A-team, isn't it?
That's the end of the A-team,
right?
That is
the A-team.
Just the beginning.
Just the beginning.
There's another one.
There we go. So we're the B team tackling those other three topics of the PSTN successor networks. I'd like to, on behalf of John and myself, thank all the members of the team. Again, we had quite a bit of discussion throughout the life cycle so far. Won't go through this slide in detail. This is just basically our charter that we had before us to identify the key elements for the IP-based communication infrastructure and looking at the successor networks and how new quality of service and robustness challenges face us. Okay, now we're not switching. Oh, there we go. Too far. As far as our progress, we've had quite a few calls, pretty much on a biweekly basis. We broke off into three teams, and Dave Clark took on the quality of service area, Mark Bayless, the user service and application identifiers area, and myself, although I have to give most of the credit to John for his effort on the robustness and public safety. We have been working with the ADIS PSTN transition landscape team as well. That we are getting input from that work that's going on within ADIS. They're looking at some of the questions we have before us and feeding information into us that we're using in our deliberations and coming up with the recommendations. And as mentioned, we did have a number of breakout sessions to address specific sub-team focus areas. So moving to the quality of service area, Dave Clark, if you'd like to go ahead and do this. I can drive if you want. Just let me know when to switch.
Let's see if that works. Okay.
Okay.
Wireless communication.
That's right.
Right. So the background to this is on the slide. The question we're supposed to look at is whether the move to other IP-based platforms will raise quality of service issues that are what we call public concern. And this brings up the issue that Kevin brought up. A variety of different IP-based platforms will be used, and we've tried to focus on making sure that all of these get some attention. Now, in order to do this, we tried to clarify some definitions here. I apologize for the small font, but I don't hold the prize. So we talked about managed IP networks and IP-based network offering services to the public, such as VoIP, but it's not a part of the public Internet. And we want to distinguish that, on the one hand, from the public Internet, which is also built out of IP, and on the other hand, a private IP network of the sort, for example, you're on right here when you attach to the FCC's network, or the one that might be run by a hotel or an enterprise. And we thought that all of these needed to be named carefully so that we could make some distinctions. We started by looking at managed networks, and these were the conclusions that we drew. The move to VoIP is well underway, and we believe that the interconnection today is often based on is moving to IP exchange points. This seems fine. Industry seems to be dealing with it. And we note that some service quality issues may be arising because of either technology or economic issues, and I'll come back to that in a second. The term QoS with capital letters to an Internet technologist tends to mean something rather narrow. It means the technical means we have in IP networks to assign different qualities to different flows. And I'm going to try in this talk to distinguish between QoS in the sense that a geek uses it and service quality to describe the quality of the experience of the phone call. And I just made a technical point in here in passing, which is that to the extent these managed nets are only carrying one service class, which is VoIP, which could change, of course. You could have video there and other stuff as well eventually. You can't use what the technologists would call QoS tools because there's nothing to prioritize. So basically these nets have to be designed based on proper provisioning, and that's what's happening. The next point, which I think most people agreed to, is that the technical details of how managed networks are built and interconnect is not something that the FCC needs to concern itself with. It's going to change. It's going to evolve. Industry is driving it. What we need to focus on is service quality, and what this slide says is focus on defining a minimal expected service quality. And in this context, we make the point that working with industry and standards bodies would be helpful to define what the metrics of quality are and again, I'll hold that thought for just a minute, encourage industry to track quality impairments over time or improvements over time, and both. And to, in particular, because of the way phone calls work on the internet or on IP, which is that a lot of the software that implements the telephone experience runs on end nodes and service nodes. It doesn't run in routers. That it's important to understand that those nodes have to be instrumented. You cannot sit in the middle of the net, watch the packets go by, and conclude whether the phone call's quality is adequate. You just can't tell. If you have a problem like echoes or something, you can't tell by looking at the packets. Now, the last sentence is one we discussed for a while, and I want to stress what it says. The conversion from the circuit to the packet-switched managed telephony doesn't change the level of concern that the FCC should have with respect to service quality. If I can go to the next slide, please. And the reason I said that is it was brought to our attention that there are some service quality issues today. And to help sort that out, this slide tries to give a little bit of framework there. For those of us, again, who think about packets, if you say QoS, we tend to think about problems related to packet carriage, loss, latency, delay, variance, and things like that. But you also see application-level problems. I talked about voice echo. I've had that happen on several occasions. You're talking to somebody, and all of a sudden, echo canceling breaks, and you hear yourself, and the phone call goes to hell. That's a term of art. And another thing which was brought to our attention is the failure of calls to complete, or calls to be terminated. And it was brought to our attention there's an issue today with call completion or call termination going into rural areas. The call is placed, goes toward a rural area. The person placing the call may hear ringback, may hear busy signal. The person to whom the call was directed doesn't hear something. And this issue, I gather, has rather been forcefully brought to the attention of the FCC. It doesn't take VoIP to make this happen. But it may be related to what we called here a hybrid call, which is to say it originates, say, in a cellular network, and it goes into a circuit switch network, and it gets to an SS7 belonging to somebody that's maybe, and you get problems with how the SS7 signaling is done. So there are issues today to track service quality writ large, not just QoS. And what we're saying is VoIP ain't going to make this any better because it's going to increase the heterogeneity in the system. And so we anticipate that there will be problems here, but it's not the sort of problem that will be solved by putting latency controls into the network. Next slide, please. So this is a point I made, and I want to stress this. You can't sit in the middle of the net and tell what's happened. You know, you can look at routers and say, well, I guess I forwarded every packet I got, and that just doesn't tell you whether the consumer is tearing their hair out at the end of the phone call. The problems can only be detected at end nodes or service points. A service point would be something that's application aware. It might be sitting at a connection point between a managed net and a public net or something like that. And I think if you're going to really keep track of service quality, you're going to need a reporting architecture that allowed end node reporting. You know, to go into an entirely different discipline, when a consumer downloads a movie from Netflix, Netflix knows whether that consumer got the movie. And the software running on the user's machine knows whether that user got the Netflix movie. You can't sit in the middle of the network and tell what happened. Maybe the user bailed in the middle of the movie. You just can't tell. And so we said here that the FCC should encourage the open development of standards, tools, and metrics to track quality. And we think this will be a recurring problem. Let's go on. Now, this gets back to the point that Kevin was making. We think it's very important in all of this conversation to remember that there are going to be different VoIP variants that are going to be interconnected. And many of the large carriers have said, yes, our approach is managed IP networks, but it's also clear there's going to be VoIP over public internet using QoS. That is to say, if I am an internet service provider, I might choose to deliver my product using QoS tools rather than a managed net. This might make sense in smaller regions where you don't want to do all the engineering of the managed net. You're clearly going to have private IP networks. This is sort of like PBXs. And you're going to have mobile VoIP services, voice over LTE. And you're going to have over-the-top things like Vonage. And we think that there should be a basic expectation that everybody understands that all of these must be able to interconnect in effective ways. And I'm not going to make any comment about regulatory interpretation. We think there should be a basic expectation. These should be able to interconnect in effective ways to provide interoperable service. And the problem with hybrid call completion today, this problem of calls, for example, going into rural areas, we believe there are going to be problems here, and the FCC should be paying some attention. Different implementations of packet-based voice are going to have different intrinsic service quality. Mobile calls don't sound like high quality calls and all this kind of stuff. We know that. So we took this position that the different economic motivations of the providers may, I'm sorry, I got to the wrong place on the slide. Different intrinsic call quality may compound issues of interconnection. That what we're trying to say is, if I'm a mobile call and I'm connecting to you, the call may sound like it's a mobile call and it may not sound that good. And there may be different economic motivations of the different providers who struggle with how to maintain intrinsic call quality. And if the call has an impairment, there's often a problem in this system, which is you can't isolate it, so you don't know where the problem is. And this is also a problem that's going to frustrate the consumer. I get a call, it doesn't work, who do I complain to? So, as a general expectation, we took the position that says points of interconnection shouldn't be the limiting factor in quality. If you have an implementation of VoIP, which is perhaps trades mobility for low quality, that's the way it is, but the interconnection should not be a further impairment here. Now, what we say now is measurement and monitoring is what's appropriate, okay? Because this is going to evolve, it's changing fast, and we have to simply pay attention as it goes on. Now, I want to come back to QoS on the public Internet. The Internet today is best effort. There are no guarantees of performance, we know that. But in most cases, it's adequate. A lot of us use Skype on the public Internet. Sometimes I end up yelling and screaming, but not usually. And often I end up yelling and screaming because something's happened at the Skype level, like all of a sudden it started echoing. Since the question we now raise is, what should the FCC's concern in this space be? And we observe that already the FCC has concerned itself with quality of the public Internet. If you look at the SAMNOS tests which have been done, they do not measure just throughput. They do some other tests as well which measure jitter and latency, and in fact those tests are proxies for classes of application like video streaming and VoIP. So I think it's clear the FCC's already said they are concerned with service quality on the public Internet, and we believe that's appropriate. We do observe that at the moment there's no attention to the question of whether there should be advanced QoS on the public Internet or whether it should continue to be best effort, and I think that's a matter for further discussion. But we do argue that its continued attention to service quality on the public Internet is justified, but this is certainly not a call for regulation. But we notice three issues that we just want to bring up in the context of the public Internet. And the first one is citizen emergency access. And this will bring us back to the discussion of public safety, which will come up later. In times of crisis, if you are mixing VoIP or other what I might call emergency critical services at a time when the Internet is impaired, perhaps because there have been major disruptions, you may get a degradation of critical services. And one of the reasons this may emerge is that the capacity of the Internet itself may be degraded in a time of crisis. So we raise this as a question. Should we be concerned about the citizens' ability to use the public Internet in times of crisis for emergency information? The second thing we bring up is the GET service. On the managed networks, which are replacing telephony, I suspect it's pretty clear people will say we need the ability for first responders and other public service, public sector people to have access. But we raise again as a question, should it be an expectation that those people will not be using the public Internet but will only be using managed services? Or should we think about what it means if first responders and the like want to use the public Internet? Do we need some sort of equivalent of GETs for the public Internet? And the third question is universal service. One of the ways you can push VoIP into everywhere is to say one of the ways of running it is over the top, on top of broadband services. And if that's the service of last resort, then you are going to have a definitional question, which is whether the thing that's being offered is of such a quality that it qualifies. And there may be some issues here because of public money or something like that. You may need to come up with a definition of what qualifies as a telephone service that satisfies the sort of service of last resort. I think these are not questions we've answered, but we raise them because they relate to the question of whether the FCC should concern itself with the quality of service on the public Internet. So we sort of come back to a few high-level principles that we articulated. We clearly think it's important to facilitate consumer choice, and as Kevin said, we don't know what the consumer is going to do in this space. With respect to universal service, we thought it was actually important to support a range of options because that may make it more economically feasible to make sure that we give everybody at least some service. We do think that there ought to be a basic expectation that different forms of VoIP telephony can interconnect at reasonable quality. And the last, which is simply a forward-looking comment, today these managed networks are associated with a very particular product, which is the replacement for traditional telephony. But there's no reason to think those will be the only services carried over managed IP networks, which means those are not the only services which will have to interconnect. And that could add complexity to the issues of the quality of service at the interconnection point, or more generally, the quality of experience at the interconnection point. I think that's it. Yeah.
Thank you. Now we'll move to the next area of the user service and application identifiers. Mark, do you want me to drive, or do you want to?
You can drive.
Okay.
It'll take too long to pass it all around. Okay, well, these are the questions that came up. Thank you. What changes might be expected in the numbering plan and optimization for IP-based communication services? For example, current numbering systems are tied to physical resources such as lines and specifics, SMS short codes. And what would be the obstacles of assigning numbers to users? Do we look at how domain name servers work, or do we look rather than service providers? And the next one is, should number assignments need to retain geographical components? For example, numbers still need to be assigned to Pacific rate centers throughout the world. In the IP world, does that carry on? Can we receiving of calls and validate that the caller is authorized for the number, for the identifier? Basically, identifier call validation. Can't tell you. That's a very contentious part. And what is the role of enum going to play in numbering and mapping services as the numbering systems evolve? Is there a need for additional or alternative solutions? And how might technological changes drive signaling requirements and numbering translation? And those were all contentious items. Okay, I'll go to the next ones. And the observations. Likely to have three main types of identifiers going forward. E164 identifier base will be network requirement for a long period of time. OTTs, service providers, and WebRTC, voice-enabled, and that's another level are disruptors to status quo. However, SIP and E64 capability will be required for VoIP interconnections with service providers, and limited interop scope of OTT services with other IP services, or PSTN, will likely limit the interoperability and capabilities of service providers. And give you a little bit onto that, as right now we have, say, Skype or other types of things are doing video or conferencing calls or advanced calls. As Skype or another group would want to talk to another one, or if they want to go to a PSTN call, or the basic identifier goes back to a phone system and it goes to the minimum requirement. So you lose all the voice or video or advanced capabilities. So there's sort of a little islands there. And then email addresses are an ideal source of global unique identifiers. They're already used for multiple services and securities, basically everything from checking bank accounts to all types of things for verification of passwords. The Commission has plenary authority over the numbers plan, but the proprietary address schemes, email-based identifiers, et cetera, fall outside of basically the scope of authority of the FCC. Should there be a plan for regulators or unregulated interop? The next is historical usage of geography and rate centers and lot identifiers. They're basically becoming more and more irrelevant, moving to 10-digit dialing everywhere. And VoIP interconnect, 911 databases all have interdependencies on addressing schemes adopted. Okay, go to the next one. And actions and baselines, current situations. Several reviews of the future of numbering identifiers have been held with working groups and the industry participants to baseline current activities. You see some lists in here of Newstar, some SIP forums with Richard Shockey. Google, Skype, Sidecar, and others have expanded the concept of direct peer-to-peer communications addressing, and but they still continue to support the E164 and SIP resources, indicators for interoperability. And drafted preliminary responses to work group questions, and they'll be final on the December meeting. And we have so many different responses and ideas that came in this group, and there's some absolutely great ideas. When we start working with the PSTN-A and the B come in, you're going to see some really good results, I believe. There are some points of disagreement in scope that are being worked on. Yes. And identified multiple uses of telephone numbers which can be considered as part of the PSTN transition plan, such as routing use of in devices, personal identification, including affinity IDs and ID verifications, general applications, and geographic location determination methods to basically map named address. Okay. All right, factors to be considered. Who owns the identity? Does it belong to the service provider? Does it provide to the end user? And that's something that the Commission should look at. Can we separate the service, the device, from the identifier? Who assures the identity? DNS base, web lookup, and PSTN, caller ID, displays, CNAME, databases. And how do we stop the caller ID spoofing as we move into more into an all IP world? How to address machine to machine, basically for cars, appliances, etc. Exploring M2M, and I saw some of the M2M stuff that was coming out. It looks like it's falling right into some. Was going to fit right in with the identifier stuff. The E164 is basically not sufficient to support 50 billion additional devices that were coming onto M2M. Should numbers be treated as names, and should numbers be a geographical component? And basically create a plan to phase out rate centers and LATAs since they really don't fit into an IP world. Okay, next slide. Okay, this one I can go over pretty quick, but basically we're trying to look at identify what type of identifiers. Here are the different characteristics. There's a URL name. Basically, if you own the domain name yourself, say, and this particular one we use alice@smith.com, and it shows the whether it's portable. Trademark issues obviously would be, depending upon the chosen, and so that person would own that particular one in that issue. A URL provider, say Gmail, that would belong to the Google in that particular one, and it shows the different issues upon the naming schemes. The E164, basically, as you can see, the components on that. That's a problem with that one is going to be scalability, and you can see the different issues on that. And the service provider, such as using Facebook names or identities. So we had a large mesh to look at things. As we go to the next slide, and this is number versus DNS and IP address. And as you can see, the identifier location, what the capabilities are in the role, country specific, number of device names, ownership, again, carrier and the other parts. As you start going to IP addresses, the IP field itself, there's some issues in there that we'll be bringing up in a later one. Utilization of mobile IPv6, for instance, so that the end device can maintain the same globally addressable IP address. Same thing. Who can obtain? You're looking at carrier. The DNS varies. Porting, and all these are issues that will continue to realm. Right now, it is most are looking at, as you'll see in our go to the next slide. No agreement. Oh, sorry. This is some of the problems with the E64 SIP VoIP endpoints. Currently, no base on bilateral exchange among operators. Often the exchange is basically a simple spreadsheet. No agreement across anonymous systems. There's AS boundaries. Limitability of enterprise to benefit from heavy investment into SIP-based systems and trunking systems, and not scalable to the 1,200 licensed operators in the United States. There's a need for new databases for the E164 phone numbers to IP translation with associated metadata. and progress not currently tracked or measured. So that's another realm. And recommendation is propose a timeline for industry to work out these problems. Yeah. Okay, potential commission actions. A clear national policy for the future of numbering is an essential precondition for further progress on the national broadband plan. SIP VoIP interconnections and invertible transition to all IP networks, and initiate a rulemaking on the full range and scope of the issues and numbers with identifiers, relational numbers to SIP VoIP interconnect to PSTN transition, and consider setting a schedule to incorporate nationwide 10-digit dialing. That'll extend the phone numbers throughout the U.S., give us a little bit of breathing room. Align LATAs and rate elimination with a bill and keep implementation date, and fully decouple geographic from number and implement geographical number portability, and sponsor multiple stakeholders forums to define requirements for E164 for real-time communications and for new databases that map the E164 to IP. Sponsor a series of technical workshops involving network operations experts to address technical translation issues and moving to all IP networks, and review the approaches with the major IP providers, basically next generations or the over-the-top, like Google, Skype, Sidecar, and others, to work with ATIS and ITF and ARIN to stay aligned with the Internet and Industry Initiative. And the reason that ARIN is mentioned there is that the FCC has authority over basically numbering and the other types of plans. But as we start working in the IP world, ARIN in North America is the people who are in charge of the IP implementation. So as we start marrying these two identifiers to IPs, I see that there's we see that there's a good need for ARIN to be involved. Next slide. And that's it.
Okay, thanks. We'll move on to the robustness in public safety. And John, do you want to present this?
We have similarly gone through a process of engaging a number of people on robustness and public safety. The questions are here. We've already drafted responses to most of these. But we'll give you a few observations that we've made. And the first thing I discovered when you start digging into this area is that there are a lot of very experienced people who have been driving and digging in this area for a long time. And there's even a certain amount of fatalism associated with the fourth or fifth version of seeing recommendations around this area. And I think that's one of the things that we have to deal with this time, is that long history. So there are specifications defined for Next Gen 911 that bring in the additional type of communications that people now use, whether it's an SMS message, whether it's a photo sent to a response center or video or what other type of data has to be exchanged. There are new interfaces that are defined to the public safety answering point. There's a 10-year history of people already at work on these standards, and there's a ton of different people around the world that have been involved, whether it's NENA, whether it's ATIS, whether it's the IETF, the ITU, even the CISRIC here at the FCC has been involved in this. There was a report last year from that group. There was a report a couple of years before that from NENA. So the industry does not lack recommendations. In fact, there are service providers in this room who already have a IP-based solution for this that they could help their communities adopt. So we have identified this as a potential area that could limit the speed of deployment away from TDM. And one of the causes, or the primary cause we would say, is that there's not the ownership of this specific issue is distributed among various federal agencies, among each of the states, and even within the states, among communities, counties, parishes, whatever you have. And because there have been multiple constituencies and they've been able to adopt specific technologies, there hasn't been any real controlling authority that's brought that together. And along with the lack of authority, there hasn't been any type of centralized funding that would encourage these communities to move along. So another complicating factor in this particular area is the number of constituencies that any solution has to address. So first, you have the situation where you have the citizen communicating with the response center. And what that means, they're changing the way that they want to communicate, whether it's sending photographs, text, or voice calls. The next area is the way authorities will be able to communicate with citizens, whether that's some sort of a public alert system, a text system, whatever that might be. And then finally, the constituencies that consist of various groups of authorities, whether it's federal with state or community with community, have to communicate on a priority basis. And those networks are out there, but that's another one of the large groups. And then you have, beyond that, as you start thinking about the way people communicate, you also need to think about the specific needs of each of the subgroups. So the end users, we've talked about a bit, but then you have the first responders, where you have things like FirstNet, where you have the need to be connected when you're out in the field real time with healthcare professionals, public safety professionals. You need the PSAPs have their own needs. They need to be able to dispatch. They need to be able to route. In small areas, it would be good to be able to overflow traffic for a lightly staffed area into one that has a larger staff. Then law enforcement has their own requirements here, and then the government agencies, of which there are many, have their own requirements that are coming out of this. And now I will say that there has been some degree of progress. I call it slow but notable, and primarily the federal government has, through various agencies, either created specifications, created requirements, or provided actually funding and grants to try to accelerate the adoption of the next generation 911 system. And that's come from a variety of different agencies, but it's billions and billions of dollars. So it includes the Commerce Department, it includes, of course, the Federal Communications Commission, it includes the Department of Transportation, it includes FEMA, Homeland Security, and even the USDA through RUS has made available funds to loan to communities who would qualify for Next Gen 911 upgrades. And so there are trials in progress, and the industry does seem to be moving forward in this area. The preliminary recommendations that we have come to is that I don't see really a lot that the Technical Advisory Council needs to add to all the different agencies who have already specified many actions. There are various reports that have similar recommendations around the technology, the funding, the policy, that type of thing. However, it would be a reasonable expectation, I think, to recommend to Congress that they designate an agency as the controlling authority on this, who would be charged with working specifically with the states. It would also, I think, be reasonable to ask that, similar to the National Broadband Plan, where 2020 was established as a date for bringing the country to ubiquitous broadband at certain speeds, it would be useful to set a target implementation date that we could then begin to align states and communities towards, and then finally do whatever is necessary to communicate that, so people understand that this is changing and that end users understand that they are having new capabilities as they go forward. Then last, the next bullet is promote standards that foster interworking. And then general conclusions, the lack of a mandate and funding is gating deployment. If we don't address that somehow, we're going to be looking at a very long period of interop between the current situation and the future as that gets deployed, and that's just going to be the reality. And then, as I mentioned earlier, there's a certain weariness among those longtime advocates who have now been working with this for over 10 years and seen variations of recommendations hit about every 2 years. So I think that's important to show that the investment that the federal government has at least made and the progress that's being made in the states to overcome sort of that pessimism that's growing around this particular issue. The next slide strictly shows a set of recommendations as an example of recommendations that are already out here. And this particular one comes from 911.gov, which I think is sponsored by the Department of Transportation. But they have a number of things like ensure that IP-enabled 911 updates are considered a fiscal priority for states and local jurisdictions. So I won't read all of them, but that's the type of thing that are out there, and they discuss how those funds get used, the amount of the funds, et cetera. So we believe this is a very important area, well-defined, well-understood. Just the lack of centralized ownership is gating the progress in this specific issue.
Thank you, John. And Tom, that completes the report out of PSTNB.
That's all?
That's all. Yeah.
I'm exhausted just listening to your report. Anybody got any comments?
There's not a C, is
there? That's right. It's just lead to... There's not a Group C, is there? Yes.
One of the things I've found helpful during transitions is to have an established baseline before things change, so we know where the issues are in a transition happening. Is there an established baseline that everybody agrees to with regards to call quality and problems with the existing network? Because if there isn't, adding a lot more heterogeneousness to the system is going to exacerbate that problem. And I would suggest we can get to work on that now before even all the other issues are being done.
Interesting. Is there a reaction to that?
I can comment on the current state that we don't actively... The closest we come within the commission currently is outage reports due to major outages. That's part of a rulemaking process, Part 4. In fact, I don't know if Jeff Goldthorpe is. It's done by the Public Safety Bureau. We don't track call quality as an ongoing function within the commission, especially end-to-end call quality. So it's a relevant observation, and that's something I talked to Tom at lunch about, that knowing the view graphs, it's not an area in which we have an active role today.
If we don't have that ability, it's going to be interesting to defend a transition against issues that it may not be responsible for, and then stopping transition at some point because of issues that people have flagged is not going to actually. I just think this is an area. If we care about it, we should measure it. If we don't care about it, then it's okay not to measure it. Right? In fact, and whether or not the FCC does it or other people do is a different point.
I'll add one other point, because I forgot what Dave mentioned, is that we've started in the IP space specifically to start measuring as part of a survey effort aspects of quality. So that's been an initiative that's been done on a voluntary basis with consumers.
Dave and Brian, you want to comment on?
Well, I think the point's an excellent one. I'm not actually an expert in VoIP. You know, I got dragged in here because I had QoS after my name, and so I'm slightly out of my breadth. I think the comment that if you don't have a baseline and you can't tell whether things are getting better or worse is a very important point. What Sam knows is doing, which is in fact tracking in-net problems such as variation in latency, that's a proxy for a certain class of call impairment, but it doesn't track call quality. And tracking call quality is not easy, but I think it's actually a issue that certainly what we recommended on the slides was you're going to have to do it. Well, somebody's going to do it because I do think we care about it. So top level debate, you raised the question, do we care? But I think there's a serious technical problem as to how you would track call quality if you take into things like failure of calls to be terminated properly, or all of a sudden I get an echo in the talk, all these things that the consumer sees as a call impairment. So I think it's a good point, and I think you've said something really significant, and I would bring that. I think that could be translated into a recommendation, which is start it now and think about how to do it.
Okay. Brian, you cool? Okay. All right, let's keep going down here. Charlotte, yeah.
So I just want to make sure that people know that this is not an issue that basically there isn't any work going on in. Specifically, I think it was it was Anthony that made the comment that because they're an incumbent LEC, they're in a different place than a lot of other people. So when you think about it, there's a lot of IP interconnects today. It's not like 5% for some people. For some people it's more like 40 to 50% is IP to IP connectivity. We deal with the issues that Dave's talking about with individually, let's say. And I think that and we can see as far as we can see, and we can know exactly what happens at that interconnect point, but we don't necessarily know on an end-to-end basis all the way from let's say here in Washington to Carlsbad. California, because we're traversing that IP interconnect. We know what it hands off to. We know how it's performing in our network. We don't necessarily know what that end-to-end quality experience is.
Okay. Kevin, Paul, and we'll just keep coming around. Joe.
Okay. Well, actually, my question was in the same area of call quality and QoS, so I guess for David. Totally agree with the observation that you need to be able to measure this from the endpoints. Have you guys thought at all about the other part of the problem, which is how call quality gets communicated to consumers in a form they can digest?
You mean we could get into the call quality equivalent of the 4G network ads?
Or the sort of branding we were talking about before? Yes.
Okay. Paul? I mean, did you ever? That was a question. Did you have a response? Yeah, bring back the pen. Okay. Paul?
Just two things really quick. Brian and John, one thing you might want to consider to include in your list of experts on the public safety robustness question is public safety themselves. There's a group called NIPSTIC, National Public Safety Telecommunications Council. They have done quite a bit of work in defining requirements for the technological consumability of different networks. Second thing is, this just fits into that observation, fits into the category of the quandary that you talked of earlier, Tom. You mentioned FirstNet and HR 3630. In that legislation is a stipulation that the Commission may create rules that allow public safety to have priority access to commercial networks or private networks. However, such access cannot preempt any existing traffic or data sessions, nor can it degrade any existing traffic or data sessions. So I'm not quite sure
what's the priority,
how you do that. So I guess my only point is it's a hard problem because in many ways the FCC's authority in many cases has already been sort of restricted or neutered.
Joe, Nomi, and Russ.
In our discussions about QoS, there was a lot of discussion around sort of the two dimensions of quality, one being call completion, and there was a lot of discussion about completing calls in a rural environment, and then basically sound quality. And I think that there is, and I suppose you could say that proper identification with spoofed caller ID is an artifact of quality as well. And, one of the things I don't think we made any firm conclusions on, is there a minimum set of specifications for what quality is? Or is a little bit of, it could be anything from something like SmartJack to a historical landline service. And I don't think we set any kind of target to say, no, a quality call means this or that. So you could then decompose the pieces of the call to make sure all the components work together. So I think that's something that probably
Does that mesh with what Milo
requires
was
a lot
saying?
more conversation.
Do you have to have that before you can get to where Milo was?
My question was primarily based towards the network that we have now, TDM, cellular, et cetera. And I think the question is, if we can come up with some definition of call quality in this context and what that baseline is, it would help inform what kind of metrics we should track in the new system. And if we don't have the former...
What Joe's talking about are components of what you're saying. That's right.
There's the managed versus managed connected to over the top and all that sort of thing. And somewhere you have to either say it's best efforts and people pay for what they get, or you say there's a minimum set of standards around either sound quality or around call completion rates. And I don't think we, in our own group, have sorted through that issue completely.
Okay, interesting. Nomi.
Thanks, Tom. I just had a question for David, for David's presentation, which was excellent. I guess I wondered, as I thought, as you think about things like defining emergency access, should we broaden our definition beyond voice and VoIP? Is there another way to be more forward-looking at that? As long as we're now here talking about PSTN transition and how we consider something like QoS, to me it seems like in the year 2012 we shouldn't just be talking about voice, but more an emergency lane for broadband IP access. So I guess I wondered if you had thoughts on that. And I think it was kind of inferred in John's presentation as well, but anyhow, that was my question.
I absolutely agree with what you just said. And I think people thinking about next generation 911 are definitely assuming that it's not just VoIP. And I think that would be a very backwards pointing assumption. So I absolutely agree. And when you think about things like next generation gets, it could be access to a web service or the cloud. So absolutely, just 100% I agree with you.
Russ?
So I've got a comment and a question. The first comment on the Connect America Fund, is there any requirements for a minimum level of QoS in that funding in terms or in reference to things like VoIP? And the reason I ask is it was called out specifically in the slide that there was a problem in rural areas where probably a lot of that funding is going. The second comment was on Mark's topic on numbering and identifiers, moving towards this sort of North American plan. One thing that's always drove me nuts is having, all these different numbering plans country to country. You take an Ethernet cable anywhere, it works. You take a phone plug anywhere, it doesn't work, just like a numbering plan. Everybody has their own numbering plan. So when you're convening some of these summits, you may want to bring in different countries' regulators and or groups like Aaron and people like that to get different feel. It would be nice to have a common numbering plan across the globe, or whatever it is, identifiers, sorry. May not be numbers, symbols. Thanks.
Okay. Well, maybe to close Milo's discussion, I just wanted people to remember that the Bell system actually did, for the legacy network, develop standards for call quality and actually had an active end-to-end measurement program which evolved from human operators to machine surveys of end-to-end calling, and that technology, to the best of my knowledge, was taken into the wireline networks of the ARA box. So there's at least a history, a standard, and a definition. Adam's shaking his head. Yeah, and a definition of what classical call quality is. So there is a good track record. If you said what's the baseline of a TDM network, there's a definitive answer to that, at least in terms of the history of the Bell system till it went dark. And it's trackable. And there are standards in terms of allocations of impairments, in fact, to different elements of the network.
Okay, Tony, and then Greg, and then we're going to move on.
Just a comment on this topic. I mean, the Bell system, whether you like it or not, is gone, and the reality is we have a much different competitive landscape. And with that, the definition of quality, the definition of 4G, the definition of everything, you obviously see in ads, everybody has their own definition. And I think what's critical here, and what will rule the day, is what, in a competitive environment, what do customers perceive? And when we did our Can You Hear Me Now brand campaign, That only worked because customers felt it was real, and that was based on connecting to the network and staying on. Those were the two elements. Now, you can argue there's more elements to call quality, et cetera, but if it resonates with consumers, it's going to be meaningful. It doesn't, we can call it whatever we want, and in a competitive environment, it's not going to matter.
Well, it is an interesting discussion when you stop and think about that. Somebody was mentioning pin drop previously, and because pin drop was the perceived issue, the idea of that kind of precision, and what you were saying, the way in which you're defining, can you hear me now, was a different. Okay, Greg, and then we'll exit.
A lot of the QoS discussion today has been based on voice, and so let me just bring to everyone's attention that in the fire alarm world, there are hundreds of millions of dialers out there that have a lot of trouble on VoIP systems. They work very well on the PSTN, but very often they get put on a VoIP and they don't connect. So we should keep that in mind. Now, our purpose here is to spur jobs and innovation. So maybe replacing hundreds of millions of those dialers is a good thing.
And on that note, so two thoughts, housekeeping wise, going forward. Mark, Brian, you're going to be next. You're on deck. And we have 3 groups in an hour to go. Now, I plead guilty to structuring it this way because we needed to get some of these issues out in the open and deal with them. But the other thing that I'm going to ask, and this is a heads up to the chairman of the working groups, that at the end of the day, one of the things I'm going to be asking you to come back to me on, and you might want to start thinking about now, is what are the kinds of actions that you want to manage to for the next meeting, and what are the kinds of actions that you want to identify and tee up for the poor people who follow you next year. So we can, start the thinking about that. Brian, we're gonna try and roll through each of these in 20 minutes. Brian and Shahed, and then we're going to clean up with the professor. Go for it.
Okay. Here we go. Thank you. Okay, so I guess we're now the RADI multi-band devices working group. So here's our charter, and everybody probably recalls that really what the focus of this working group is to look at how bands are being allocated, that cell phones or handsets are being asked to accommodate, and see if essentially that the allocation of bands are they outrunning the ability of the handsets to keep up with them, and is there something that this group can do to help that situation? So, and below here are the working group members. We've had a few experts who consult with us, some very good people who are in the component supply business to the cell phone industry. Problem statement, well, here it is sort of in a picture, and you don't really need to see the details tossed in a little hidden, but really what it's showing is the allocation of bands in the 3GPP documentation, and it's growing rapidly, and it's growing rapidly around the world. And of course, 3GPP documents all the band allocation. Plus, there are other radios in there, as we know, for navigation, Bluetooth, Wi-Fi, and others. So I won't go through all these points, but it's becoming a more complex world, at least in terms of the RF design. So there's one theme that has kind of stuck with us the whole time in this discussion as we've wrestled with this problem. I don't think we think of our group. I'd say it's not exactly a target-rich environment. It's a complex problem, but there's no
it's being worked pretty well by private industry, and I'll get to that in a minute. But one thing that we've talked about consistently over all our meetings has been this idea of a roadmap, and essentially that an informed FCC is going to be the best partner in allocating spectrum going forward. So to the extent we can help the FCC understand what the equipment and the components are able to do, we'll be in a good situation. So just looking back on second quarter, we kind of where we came from really was drilling down on what handsets are doing and what their sort of track record and future progress is going to be. It's pretty clear that the digital part is doing well, and mostly due to Moore's Law, that the baseband chips have a lot of capability there. The part that doesn't scale so well is the RF front end for a variety of reasons, but essentially what you end up doing is having a chain of components there for every band you want to support. The last thing we did at the end of the second quarter, we started digging into how much tunability there is in these new designs. So in the third quarter, what we did, there was actually a forum or a workshop the FCC put on that was exactly on this subject that our working group's been dealing with, future wireless band plans. Forum, a bunch of people in our working group, and some of the experts we ended up using were part of that. So we spent some time talking to those experts about what technology is available, what's in handsets today, and what's likely to be moving into handsets, and try to understand that rate of change. And we've looked at a number of sort of roadmap contributions. So we're not anywhere close to what I think we would consider the real roadmap we would like to develop for the FCC or with the FCC, and that'll be sort of the punchline at the end of this presentation. But we have taken some bits and pieces, and we'll look at that in just a minute. So sort of the backdrop to this is a very robust industry that if you look at just the number of units being delivered, so there's prediction for 2012 from IDC worldwide is 1.8 billion units, and CEA's numbers for U.S. sales are 168 million, $39 billion. So these are huge numbers, and it's kind of hard for the FCC to move the needle on something that has that much economic momentum behind it. There's plenty of reinvestment here, but we can always make that dialogue better. And so if you look at kind of this ecosystem chart here, really what we're talking about, these are sort of the players that get involved. Standards are behind it. They document rather than drive, I feel like. I mean, they're more responsive. I think what we want to do is set up better exchange between what's happening in the spectrum allocation block over in the upper right corner with this very strong, and what I tried to indicate with the bolder arrows there, this very strong supply chain from component suppliers, handset suppliers, and carriers. And document that, really the carriers and handset suppliers, this food chain that ends up with the products in consumers' hands, that's a very robust system, and it's so far been adequate for delivering this supply of new phones and features. These are big investments handset manufacturers are making and chipsets. So anytime you turn a new chipset, handset designs, I suspect, are at least tens of millions of dollars to develop a new handset, depending on how much you're reusing. And the second bullet, and sort of the point of all this, is there's really high volumes, and that's what makes the industry respond. As one of our participants puts it, development follows opportunity. So there's lots of people looking at pain points in these designs and responding to it. But the bottom line is there's really complex work going on to balance what consumers are asking for, and I'm sure carriers are doing lots and lots of consumer research to try to understand that, putting in all the band support that they need, squeezing out every tenth of a dB, and then making the batteries last a long time, all with a very thin, as light as they can get at phone with a big touchscreen on it nowadays. Okay, so here's, maybe we should have started with the block diagram, but here's what we've been working at, sort of the current architecture for phones. So on the far left, you have the baseband part. So it's digital, and we don't see that as the problem area, if you will. And I guess we'd stand to be educated, but we have some suppliers in that segment of the market. The radio frequency IC, the sort of mixed signal part there that's next, is less so. But as you get into the 5 bigger white sections there, this is the whole RF front end, and the part that hasn't scaled as the way the baseband, the digital part, has. And so right now, essentially, when you're accommodating new bands, you're laying down you put in new PAs for those bands and filters and switch them, and something's going to give. But what that brought up is sort of this debate in our group. There are companies who are supplying into that discrete RF front end space, doing filters and PAs and everything, and they're working hard to meet the handset manufacturers and carriers' needs. There are people working on the tunability part, and so they're essentially in competition. You sort of think of it as a track, sort of our current track of, you shrink components and do more, and you don't have to jump off the track and suddenly start doing tunability. But the way we look at it now, this discrete RF front end, it kind of owns the bulk of the market right now. So both these technologies may be available, but you need to look at who's shipping in volume. And right now, discrete is the big volume. The tunable components, sort of these new competitors, if you will, are finding areas where they can make an entree into these handsets. And this is just sort of playing out in the market here. But what we'll see, I think, is that market forces are going to drive both these groups. Some of them are very big suppliers, very big companies making reinvestment. Some of them are new, sort of betting on new technologies. So here's, sorry, let me get the slide synchronized here. So this is sort of the current path. So if you ask the people who are in this discrete front-end kind of business to look at a sort of a short-term roadmap, here's what you'll see. So that top kind of swim lane there, the number of bands supported, you really need to add 4 to those. So where it says 2 under 2011, that's in addition to the quad-band GSM capabilities already in there. And they expect to be able to work by shrinking components. Sort of that bottom swim lane talks about component size for PAs and duplexers, how they're doing some of the PA technology in terms of what's it's tracking against, whether they're single band components or dual band, and just doing more integration than supporting multi-band. So if you talk to that industry, you get this, here's where we're going, and so their guess would be in 2015 you'll just see more PAs and more integration, and it's all going to be okay. On the other hand, if you talk to companies who are really working hard on the tunable front end part, this is their projection. And it's not completely in conflict, not in conflict at all. I mean, they see they're working their way into areas where, as we said, there's the most pain or the most opportunity. So you see some things happening on the antennas as you go out in time from this year out to 2016. Sort of working back, really if you think about that previous chart, the block diagram, the tunability is working backwards from the antenna back into the receiver. Let me see which areas we need to highlight here. So number of bands supported, this is already in effect added the quad band GSM, so they're looking to compare to the previous chart, you could subtract 4 from these numbers. So they're not, it's maybe slightly more aggressive in terms of number of bands supported. There are also some metrics of tunability. The people who are looking at tunable front ends, that they believe they'll have an advantage over discrete in terms of like instantaneous bandwidth, some of the capability they'll be able to support. And probably carrier aggregation, I suspect, will be something they're trying to do better maybe than discrete components. Same thing for antenna technology. So there's some companies out there looking at tunable antennas, how to do fancier things with antennas to get them matched, to get all the power out of the PA and out into the air. So I won't walk through all these, but it starts kind of the stuff they're doing right now, what they call open loop matching, where basically it uses a lookup table and it just says I'm operating a certain frequency, so switch in these components. Then they're going to go to these closed loop where it's actually got a feedback to it, and band switching. Then you see on down the line much fancier things like beam steering, where you're actually switching antennas on purpose to try to steer the signal. And then lastly, to get away from the 50 ohm that the transmission path, the characteristic impedance is 50 ohms, which may not be the best thing, but it's sort of the way everything's done right now. That's probably a bigger change in overall industry infrastructure. Okay, recommendations. Here's a couple that really came out of the forum. I probably should have split it out in two different slides. But anyway, one was pretty easy because this was clear. The industry works on 5 megahertz blocks, so there was a predisposition and recommendation. Stick with that. So as we go to allocate new channels for mobile communication, the 5 megahertz is what the industry, blocks of 5 megahertz is what the industry works against. The other piece that came up is a little less specific, is more of a general concept in that, in general, because the bandwidth is asymmetric, the usage is asymmetric now, more downlink than uplink, to consider allocating unpaired spectrum for downlink only. And the idea behind this was to do it opportunistically. In other words, even if you can't get it nationwide or all the time, if it can be available so that you can use it where and when, let them figure out how to do that. So don't let best be the enemy of good in this case. If there's something there that can be used for extra downlink opportunistically, then do that. These are just some of the benefits of those two, which I pretty much just touched on. A lot has to do with global harmonization and then just responding to the asymmetric, the predominance of downlink for data. Okay, and last is the next steps, and really what we're spending most of the time trying to figure out is this roadmap issue. Oh, let me hit this first bullet. We have talked about testing, and we haven't really drilled down to an answer on this yet. There's some feeling among members that we're going to have more testing problems as handsets become more complicated. There's not complete agreement on that yet of what we need to do there, but it's something we're talking about. Then the rest has to do with this handset technology roadmap. And the idea here that, as I mentioned, has been kind of a recurring theme for us. There's a belief that the technology is going to catch up or pass the spectrum, the band allocation. That ultimately, we'll get there with enough tunability and flexibility and fast enough A to Ds that the handsets will be able to do whatever we need them to do on the spectrum. We're just not sure how far out that is. And so we feel like we need this roadmap. The semiconductor industry has done this for a long time. It's very good about sort of charting this vision of how small the transistors need to be to stay on track. And from that, they derive, we know we got to get to a certain type of lithography or something. So the idea here is let's look 10 years out and figure out what are the technologies that are likely to be in handsets. And here's kind of a list of characteristics since we haven't exactly figured out how to do them, but we know it needs to look far enough out to be relevant for spectrum planning purposes. The charts I showed you are a few years. which may inform a little bit, but probably not for multi-year band planning purposes. We don't want it to, we're not trying to pick technology winners. We're not trying to say, certain types of tunable components are the way to go and everything else is off the roadmap. There's an issue of, and this is sort of a classic problem, you can create it one time, so maybe we put a bunch of effort in, but really it needs to be updated over time. So there's sort of a who owns it, who maintains it over time issue. And the other piece is that the roadmap needs to be relevant for spectrum allocation. So just to say that in 8 years we believe we'll have A to Ds that are a certain speed and precision is not helpful. It needs to be translated into, and that means something for people doing spectrum allocation, that we can do something new with bands that we couldn't do before. And that's it.
Thank you, Mark. This is great. Are there any thoughts for this? I'd like to put in abeyance the 5 megahertz question until we hear Shahed, because he's going to come from a slightly different angle, and we can discuss that in that kind of context. Kevin.
Yeah, just a quick comment that the idea of using unpaired downlink spectrum would fit in well with the trend towards small metro cells in urban areas as well, because you can deploy those opportunistically. So see some synergy there in increasing trends towards these small cells.
Any other comments? We're going, David?
Actually, I had a question on that, whether did you consider as a sort of generalization of that TDD, which would then sort of defer the question as to how the partitioning is between upstream and downstream?
We didn't. We haven't. We can bring it up. I can talk to you after, see if there's an issue. I mean, this was a recommendation made by one of the members that I don't recall it being very, highly disputed or anything. It seemed logical, but we haven't.
But that's a very that's a really worthwhile question.
It might just be a way to preserve some flexibility while still achieving the goal.
Okay.
All right, let's try and keep rolling here so that Dennis doesn't have to do the speed talking.
All right, Tom. Got 20 minutes. Can I have the slides up, please? There we go. Okay, great. Let me see if I can advance this. All right. So just very quickly, I wanted to highlight what we've achieved, our plan. So as you can see today, we're going to walk you through our preliminary and initial set of recommendations based on our industry outlook that we conducted over the last, I would say, 4 to 6 months. So we've collected a lot of data, talked to a lot of people, a lot of ecosystem players, and I think we've got some pretty good ideas what we want to recommend. So that's today. We're going to test some of these out at CTI and coming up in October. So we do have one more cycle of touching base with the industry groups to ensure what we're doing is not just something we cooked up in the vacuum. So we want to get everybody's feedback.
And you told me earlier you're going to have 700 people at that today.
Well, we're hoping it's much less than that, because the room can only accommodate 200 people.
Okay. You were being facetious. 200 people, still a lot of people. Okay.
Indeed. So here's the preliminary and initial list of recommendations that we think we can proceed forward with now. I would caveat this by saying not all of these are quick wins, and also some of them are probably not very implementable in the short run. So there's still some vetting to be done, but this is the list we're going to move forward with as far as our initial recommendations concerned. Let me go through each one of them in some very quick level of detail. Let me bring your attention to recommendation bullet point, third one down. So first one, I think many of you would agree there's a whole movement around sharing of spectrum. We've seen this with white space And this is something actually Marty Cooper came up with. Maybe we should think about and contemplate something like this for M2M specifically. One area of potential sharing could be in the radar space, around 2.7 to 3.1. As many of you know, the radar occupies spectrum only when it's doing the sweeps. And I think to that extent, we could leverage when it's not in use. So that's one area. Second, we're calling this the M2M Service Registration Database, although I'm not a big fan of the name itself or the database de jour. But this is something we've heard from many of the ecosystem players we interviewed, that there needs to be a LNP-like database in the country to manage not only interoperability, interconnection, but also roaming and things like management of security for some of these devices that are out there. More to this, there's a lot more detail that we need to kind of figure out, but that's something many of the folks we talked to said it's needed and could be implemented in the short run. Third, creating a numbering and addressing plan. We've heard this across the board today, that not only we're going to run out of phone numbers, but also with IPv4, we're increasingly hitting a ceiling point. And so the idea here is how do we onboard these new applications that are ranging from everything from consumer devices through very secured enterprise level devices that are out in the field to have an address plan. In Europe, we found out that the European Union has mandated that every machine-to-machine device should have its own area code, if you will. So it's a very interesting idea, but I think it's falls short in terms of the IPv6 migration path. So that's another area that we could potentially explore. Fourth, and this is something Walter, I nominate Walter for this one. FCC could have a specific, now I don't know whether it's a bureau or if it's a group, but could be focused specifically on M2M. We all hear how big it's going to be, but there isn't a logical place to discuss M2M issues or challenges or even driving policy around M2M. So one idea is to create a center of excellence within the FCC itself. So, and I nominate Walter for that. That's right, to be the center of excellence.
I thought you were Walter's, I thought you were Walter's friend.
One person would say.
A fifth recommendation is around certification process. I'll give you an example. We spoke to some device manufacturers that specifically make devices for variable computer for applications such as remote diagnostics, wellness, and all that. And they talked about, look, we have to get HIPAA compliant, we have to get FDA compliancy, and then we have to get FCC to okay it. It's a lot of certifications, and it is really holding up innovation and time to market. So that's something we could also improve on and address and explore. So that's our fifth recommendation. Sixth, as we heard again today from Kevin and others, there's a lot of devices, and specifically M2M type devices on the 2G network, including, we found out, elevators. Not only they're on PSTN, but they're also on cellular devices, which is very interesting by itself. And when you talk to these vendors and providers of these services, whether it's the vending machine supplier, all of them say, well, there's no incentive to go to 3G or 4G for that matter. It's too expensive, and we're not sure if it's going to have the same type of ROI. So I think one of the big concerns they have is, well, show us what the roadmap is. How do we get on board to these networks? And I think there is a need to bring together the roadmaps, all of the carriers, and communicate these to these individual ecosystem players. So that's our sixth, and our final recommendation is around seeding the market to spur more M2M innovation. And we've seen a lot of real cool applications come up. There was a Wall Street Journal article a couple of weeks ago how some of these smaller companies are innovating, from everything from figuring out if your pipe outside your house is freezing up and how to alert you through Wi-Fi, through other companies just building a hardware API so you can build your own M2M app. And I think there's a lot more out there, and I know there's a lot of VCs in the company, Tom, and we also have other folks here. I think there's something to be said about seeding this market and really getting these companies out in the marketplace. So there's a lot I've said here. Let me just jump to the punchline. I think there's some quick wins. Namely, I think the certification, registration database, the Center of Excellence here at FCC, and perhaps even seeding the market are some of the things we could probably get started on and really make an impact on M2M in the short run. That's sort of our plan. By our next December meeting, we'll probably have 2 or 3 very concrete, solid recommendations that we can start pursuing.
That's a great, thank you. I mean, this has been a difficult issue to get your arms around, and that's a very succinct, very direct, and then even graphically expressible plan. So thank you, Shahed. Anybody want to raise anything on it? Brian?
I would just like to talk about recommendation 6, your 2G network.
Yes.
If there's modules out there operating on 2G today, they're probably operating in licensed spectrum. So I'm not sure how you would create a nationwide 2G network. If it's in different spectrum, then obviously you've got...
Oh, no. So just let me clarify. We're not here to create a brand new 2G network. The idea was to create a roadmap for the M2M providers so they know how to onboard to 3G and 4G.
Okay, that's different from what the recommendation title says. Okay.
Yeah, we actually ended up switching that.
That's the right.
Nobody wants to create another 2G network.
That's the right answer. Anybody else? Thank you, and Shahed, and thank you for listening. Dennis, over to you.
The magic wand is coming. And I am impressed. I was presuming that I would have 10 minutes at the end to share. So you did extremely well. Yeah. Our focus is on receivers and spectrum, and I'd like to begin by highlighting the working group, but I'm particularly going to highlight Bob Pavlak and give him a shout out because he's done a terrific job on behalf of our group in pulling things together. So I really appreciate his work and sound that out to the whole group. As a reminder to you all, our charter is to focus on receivers and their role in creating efficient use of the spectrum. This actually comes somewhat from our last year's work on spectrum efficiency, but this critical role of looking at systems, not just transmitters, is the focus of our efforts. The key, therefore, that goes under that charter is that we need to be sorting through the various ways of accomplishing spectrum efficiency, the band packing and increasing access and so on, and how that can be driven at this systems level. Specifically, and this sort of is the tip-off to our recommendations that will come at the end, but the couple of things that are key is that up front we assert who will need to bear the cost for mitigating harmful interference, and that really comes in two flavors. One is a recommendation around the interference limits policy. We'll be expanding on that. And second is the receiver standards database, or more of a web portal to get to receiver standards to enable the developers of receivers to be more effective in what they do. The second part of this is one that technology should provide us, and we've seen a lot of that in some of the earlier presentations. But nurturing the technology in the receiver domain to give us greater flexibility and to enhance the efficiency is the other key, therefore. From a case study standpoint, we have looked at where to apply this technology from a spectral standpoint, and we've examined 4 areas, and those are listed, and this was really highlighted in last quarter's review. But digital television bands, the 2.4 band, the 3550 to 3650 band, 2700 to 2900, all of which have in one way or another been mentioned earlier, and then also the 1755 to 1850 that is being so carefully examined by the CSMAC organization. And those who are laughing, you can identify the CSMAC members by the laughter that is emerging at this point. There are, for those not initiated to the laughter, the CSMAC organization has identified 5 separate working groups, 4 of which are specifically focused on various applications within the 1755-1850 band. So it is receiving intense scrutiny at this point, and certainly it is a band of interest as we go forward.
My favorite is the precision-guided munitions interference with cell phones. That's my personal opinion.
Yes. This is when they land or when they fly?
Yes. I'm on that subject.
The last call.
But it's classified, so I actually don't know what they do.
Yeah.
This is true. I'm not making this up, guys.
That is why the laughter, we won't even mention how many people are on that working group, which is something over 100.
The first time I was ever on a conference call, when I called in, it said, "You are number 86 joining the call."
When your call is important.
In any event,
go on.
In any event, there is a great deal of interest in that particular band, and it does play and does relate to our receiver effort. So there is a tie-in here. If we could get back to the slides, then. The first area of focus for us is the Accessible Standards Repository, which this morning we decided wasn't a repository for those who are going to jump up and say repository means. It really is more of a web portal or maybe a database, but it's a directory system that would be hosted by the FCC so that there would be a one-stop shop for at least finding the receiver standards insofar as they exist in the various areas. Because in many cases there are receiver standards within an organization, within a group, but they're not well understood by the adjacent organization. And actually referencing back to this 1755-1850 area, one of the great things that's come out of that work is the amazing amount of information transfer between organizations. And I think it's a backdrop to the need for the database that's identified here. This really should enable, and its whole purpose is to enable improved receiver design through the provision of greater access to the knowledge that's needed on the transmitters in adjacent bands. In this area, there are, as examples of the bands that have a lot of specification in place, we did the deep dive. We were very fortunate to have Lynn Cloudy and Brian Markwalter, who represent the television industry on both sides of it, and took the deep dive. And there are significant standards available in that industry that are nonetheless not widely known. And this was our examination case of how fruitful it might be to put this portal in place, and certainly it appears to be that case. We also looked at the LMR band, and I'm not sure that he knows it, but Paul Steinberg, your organization, was quite helpful in identifying and providing us with the LMR standards, so thank you. And we also looked in and dug into the 3GPP standards for cellular.
which are very, very extensive, and we have several representatives who are knowledgeable in that area, but Bob Pavlik dove into that for us. So we think this would be a very, very fruitful area for us to pursue, and did the examination. The key next step in this is, where do you put it? If you're going to put a standard or a standard form of a database or a portal, where would we put it? And we identified that there, in fact, is already a very nice place to put this information, and that is in the FCC Spectrum dashboard. I'm not sure how many of you are frequent visitors to the Spectrum dashboard, but it's really quite a useful part of the FCC's database. And the perspective for us is that we could simply add receiver standards into that database, and since it's already one that is familiar to many, the means of navigating and finding the information should be pretty direct, and we really feel very, very good about that, and we'll move forward with a strong recommendation in that area. Next area was in the technology advancement area. Certainly there is a lot that technology will bring us in receivers and continues to bring us in the goal to move to greater spectral efficiency. The notion here is that we do have, and in fact we've already had some coverage of some of these areas, a lot of activity already underway. A few of the areas that haven't been highlighted already are the great movement forward in the software-defined receiver area, software-defined radio in general, but software-defined receiver. The theme there, and in a couple of the other technology movements, is to continue to drive the software down into the lowest of low levels of what we have historically viewed as hardware-only domains, to give more flexibility and more agility in the receiver design, even as we've found it in so many other areas. We think that is on the way. There's a lot in this area to allow for wider coverage, so that the front end can cover a much wider band. We've just seen in the last two presentations ago some of the good work that's being done in the cellular area in widening out the bands, widening out the antenna systems, and so on. But we believe that is more general than just cellular, and that as that technology moves forward, it will give us much greater flexibility in this area that will enable us to get a lot of the positive characteristics that we're looking for. We think that in this area there are actions to be taken. Multi-stakeholder groups can be very helpful in driving forward the designs for receivers, and you're going to see more of this in a moment. We also think that it's valuable to incentivize this future-proofing of the receiver, because one of the keys is existing receivers with new systems and services that are provided next door, and how to give that flexibility after the fact. But I think there are ways to do that, and a lot of the technology that's coming will give us that capability. Finally, the interference limits policy, which is probably the newest area. Many of you are familiar with this. We have already talked about it in two prior sessions. In fact, even talked about it last year. But this is a maturing area, and we believe that this does have great promise. We do need to move in this area, both from a technology standpoint, but also from an education standpoint. The notion here is that for those of you who are not entirely familiar with the area, is that this would provide an upfront statement on the adjacent band transmission power profile. So that is the focus on what you're going to see in the adjacent band. And I really should highlight, I gave an earlier couple of call-outs, but let me call out Pierre de Vries, who's not at the formal table, but Pierre has been actually carrying the heavy lifting in this interference limits policy, and assisted to some level by Dale Hatfield, but this has been a really key area that he's been driving for some period of time, and he's making believers out of all of us within the work group, which is not always easy, but kudos to Pierre. The focus here, though, is to make sure that we have defined the environment that a receiver needs to operate in, and particularly the environment in this adjacent band area. Sometimes there's confusion with other areas that have been mentioned in the past, in part because of the similarity in names, things like interference temperature, which is now a somewhat discredited area, and this is not interference temperature. This does not allow for sharing within a band, and in fact doesn't talk about what happens within the receiver band. It talks about what happens in the adjacent bands. It talks about the environment. So it's a key area there. It does not mandate the receiver performance either. It really provides the environment where the receiver design can proceed, but it's a designer beware kind of structure. This is the environment in a much more structured way than we've had in the past for the receiver designer to deal with. And it's hopeful that through that we will be able to avoid a lot of the challenging situations like the most noteworthy GPS light squared that we've all lived with in the last little while. From a implementation standpoint, good idea. Now what do we do with it? Notion. The key is to identify the band boundaries where we need to apply this new policy capability. And the place where this will have the most value is at the boundary of dissimilar systems. So things like cellular broadcast, licensed, unlicensed, cellular with satellite, and so on. These areas are going to be some of the key areas for us to understand. When you're sitting with homogeneous environments like a cellular band adjacent to a cellular band, everyone knows what to do. That's works very, very well. We have many, many instances of it. But it is in these areas where you have groups and service providers that are not necessarily familiar with what the adjacent band usage profile looks like, and sometimes it's organizational, federal government uses versus commercial uses, and so on. One of the things that we've spent a lot of time talking about, and this is where Dale in particular inserted himself, is the multi-stakeholder process as a way of getting to a logical endpoint. Anyone can establish an interference limit policy and establish the worst possible scenario and have everything work perfectly, but you're not going to get any efficiency from the spectrum utilization if you approach it in that way. By using a multi-stakeholder process, the anticipation is that this process would yield a result that would be optimized, particularly for the groups that are currently involved. The one challenge in this area of multi-stakeholder is how do you future-proof it? And this is one of the key roles for the FCC, not to be involved in a direct way, but to be involved in an indirect way to watch the process to ensure that the outcome of the process does take into account potential future scenarios, to make sure that things haven't been done in a way that completely optimizes the spectral use for today's environment, but obviates any possibility of any change in the environment in the future. So it's a key opportunity for the stakeholders, be they commercial or commercial with government, to work together with the FCC, sort of serving as an honest broker to make sure that in the end that there is a consensus perspective, or at least there is enough information to be able to move forward with appropriate FCC processes, and to make sure that again that future world is taken care of. So that brings us to our recommendations, and this is where Tom will be absolutely delighted, because our first actionable recommendation is totally actionable now.
Bingo.
And this is to implement the FCC dashboard enhancement to include receiver standards. And this is something that Julie has agreed that we can and should proceed with it fundamentally right now. The notion is that we would fold this in, as we've talked about in the dashboard, the receiver standards in the dashboard, and that we would use public notice to solicit information that would help to populate the dashboard and then continue forward with that. So this is, I think, a terrific example of a success for the TAC, in that we have something that I think we can move forward on right away that will be of considerable value to a large audience. The second is to initiate the interference limits policy trial. Since this is a new area, I'm sure we'll have lots of challenges as we move forward. The precise parameters to be nailed down is one of the challenges of this. But we believe that this approach, as an approach, has enormous merit, and that we need to move forward. We need to move forward in establishing initial multi-stakeholder processes to move forward in this direction. And we do think that industry leadership is critical. The initial focus that the group would like to recommend is the 3550, 3650. This is consistent with the PCAST report, and so it's a terrific area where we can follow. And in fact, in particular, there's an opportunity in specific areas to pursue in the PCAST context, the secondary and tertiary usage with cellular and lightly licensed technology, and the interaction amongst those, and to do that in a place where the government primary would not be present. And being from Chicago, and actually I'm going to recognize John Tova, who's sitting in the back, the Chief Technology Officer of the City of Chicago. There is interest in pursuing that from a Chicago standpoint, so this is something we actually, although I've been working on pieces of this, it did not come together until this morning's meeting, but I think this gives us an opportunity to move forward in this area rather rapidly to do an initial test in this area, and so this is something we're looking to move forward to pursue. Ongoing work, there's a lot of parallel work that's proceeding at the FCC itself. There is work on 2.4 gigahertz Wi-Fi receiver testing that plays very much into this space and is one of the bands that we've been looking on. And the group has been involved in reviewing the activities and providing our input into the FCC under Julie's leadership to look at that and to learn from that area. We've also examined to some degree the Japanese model in this area, which is an interesting model for developing recommendations and the interplay between the regulatory group and the standards organization, and how to maximize that benefit, and how that work in Japan might be applicable here in the United States, and how it might not be applicable. Also looking for, in our ongoing work, how to incentivize movement in the receiver area. NSF-sponsored research may be one, other areas as well. The one ongoing work item that is not listed here, but one that in line with Tom's request, what we're going to do by next quarter. Our next quarter goal is to have a white paper in the space for the interference limits area, and we're getting close into at least an executive summary of that, and then would follow that with a full paper that would be of use to the TAC. And with that, Mr. Chairman.
Excellent. Dennis, thank you, as always. Comments or thoughts for Dennis? Again, a spot-on and actionable set of recommendations. And let me see then, if there are no comments, going once, going twice, let me see if I can pick up on the kind of tone that Dennis was setting there at the end and talk a little bit about where we go from here. I began by joking about the questions get tougher this season at TAC, which clearly they have. You can't sit through a session like today, however, and not walk away with, yes, the belief that the questions become more complex, but also the belief that you all have done just an outstanding job at parsing all of these and identifying the issues and sub-issues. I mean, there must have been 30 or 35 kinds of recommendations that have come to the fore during the course of the last 3 hours. The challenge now is, how do we focus those down on the things that we want to recommend to the Commission that they do? Dennis just gave us a specific example with the spectrum map in the website. And
And we need to think in terms of the fact that it's now September. We have one more meeting in December, and then it's going to be 2013. And one of the things that we need to help our successors think about is if we could pass off to them, here are issues that we have helped gestate that take more time and that we would urge that you deal with. But between now and December, what are the 2 actionable items that could come out of each working group? And in the PSTN, I mean A and B, two each. And if you got 3, nobody's going to complain. But we got half a dozen groups. And where I would like to end up the year, and I'm opening this for discussion and your thoughts, is if we could end the year with a report to the Commission that says, here is a box score, that we have made the following sets of recommendations to you. We have seen the following implementation. Julie's taking care of Dennis's latest idea, gets a big check in it, for instance. But these are the kind of things that, let's go back to the fact that the chairman tasked us early on, bring back things that we ought to be doing. Don't just have a graduate session. And so if we can come back, and if each of the working group chairpersons can manage the group, and I ask the staff at the same time that's supporting these groups to help in that regard, to come to December with 2 actionable recommendations for us to forward to the Commission, and then and here are the things that we think are worthy of being handled by the next body. Because there are an awful lot of things here that are going to take a lot of years to chew on. But there are also a lot of things that we can deal with and urge the Commission to move on with dispatch. And we ought to parse those. Does that make sense, various committee chairs and fellow members of the TAC? Is that a mandate that we can all live with? And then we can end up this year and say, okay, here's at least a dozen things that we've really worked on that were undeveloped when 2012 began and ended 2012 with a set of recommendations that we've made to the Commission, and this is what they ought to be doing.
You want suggestions for a new list as well for 2013?
I'm sorry?
Would you like suggestions for a new list as well?
Sure, that's okay. And so Walter is saying, are there thoughts about what new topics ought to be for 2013? I do think that we're in a period where it's going to take a matter of time to crunch through a bunch of these issues that are still remaining. So there will be legacy issues going forward, no doubt. But if there are new issues that anybody thinks ought to be brought up, we ought to put those on the table as well. But I really want to make sure that we fulfill our commitment that we made when we started 2 years ago to the Commission that says we will deliver to you actionable recommendations. And I think you all have them. And let's just fine-tune them and make that the goal for December. Comments? Questions? We cool? Is there anything else that anybody would like to bring for the group? We have one hard and fast rule here. We end at 4 o'clock. Meeting adjourned. Thank you. Thank you. Very good.